The cub was already inside the workshop when Vesson found the courage to look through the gap in the rocks, and that was the detail his report would never be able to explain. He lay flat on the cold ridge above the gullet, plated belly pressed to stone still warm from the day, and he watched through a fissure no wider than his hand. Below him, in a canyon the whole thorn concession swore no living thing crossed twice. A human female sat on an overturned crate with a Corin pup draped across her boots. The pup was the size of a warhound. Its 6 limbs were folded under it the way a domestic animal folds when it has decided nothing in the world will hurt it. And the human was not looking at it at all. She was frowning at a coil regulator in her lap, tapping it against her knee and humming. Vesson's translator caught the humming and marked it as non-linguistic. It did not mark that his own dorsal plates had gone flat with terror. He had come to confirm a rumor and file it away as a lie. 10 days ago the concession had logged a salvage claim inside the gullet. Inside, past the marker line, the survey drones would not fly beyond because their optics kept coming back full of moving shapes. Nobody claimed the gullet. The gullet was where the moon's stripped-out machines went to rust and where the Corin denned, and the Corin were the reason Ceph-9 had a beast clearance budget larger than its water budget. A claim inside meant a corpse inside. Overseer Drock had said as much, laughing, and told Vesson to go survey the remains so the paperwork could close. There were no remains. There was a lit workshop with a swept floor, a rack of sorted parts catching the last red light, a hand-lettered board he could not read, and a young human humming to an apex predator that could have folded her in half. A second Corin came around the parts rack. Vesson stopped breathing. This one was grown, full-grown, plate-shouldered, the long, low kind that the clearance crews called Ridge Kings because you only ever saw the ridge of their backs before they took someone. It came into the lamplight without a sound, and Vesson's whole body understood, in the old way that lived under thought, that he was looking at a killer that had killed many times. It walked up behind the human. It lowered its enormous scarred head, and it set its chin down on her shoulder, gently, the way a tired thing leans on the only thing it trusts. "Evening, Deacon," the human said without turning around. Vesson did not remember climbing back down the ridge. He remembered running. Ren Halloran felt the big male's weight come onto her shoulder and adjusted her spine to take it without dropping the regulator. Deacon leaned heavier when he was hungry and lighter when he'd already fed, and tonight he was light, which meant he'd caught something out past the wrecks and eaten it warm. Good. She hated the nights he came in hollow. A hollow Corin made the little ones nervous, and nervous little ones chewed her cabling. "Off," she said, and nudged the pup on her boots. "Up you get. I can't work with you on my feet." The pup, she'd been calling it Nettle, for the notch some fight had taken out of its left ear before she ever met it, grumbled and rolled and did not move. Ren sighed and worked her boots free one at a time, and Nettle flopped into the warm dust by the forge with the boneless outrage of any young thing denied a lap. She'd been in the gullet 104 days. She'd counted, at first, the way you count anything you expect to end. Now she counted out of habit. The math of how she'd ended up here was simple and not flattering. She was 26, she was a fair mechanic and a poor liar, and she'd come out to the Ceph system on a contractor's berth that turned out to be 3/5 a scam. The concession paid Thren wages to Thren and scrap to everyone else. When her berth folded, she'd had 2 options: sell her tools to buy passage home, or find work no Thren would take. The gullet was work no Thren would take. 6 kilometers of dead mining rigs, drag lines, and hopper trains, all abandoned in place when the seam ran out, all full of copper and rare earth armature and precision bearings that were worth a fortune to anyone willing to walk in and pull them. Nobody was willing to walk in, because of the Corin. Ren had walked in on her first morning with a cutting torch, a water can, and no idea she was doing anything remarkable. She'd found the first pup that same afternoon, half crushed under a fallen conduit, screaming a sound she'd feel in her teeth for the rest of her life. She had not thought about apex predators or clearance budgets. She had thought, that's a baby and it's stuck and I have a jack. That was the whole origin of everything that came after, though it would take the Thren a year and a war scare to understand it. She'd jacked the conduit up. She'd pulled the pup out. She'd splinted a bent limb with a length of hydraulic line and fed it water off her own fingers because it was too shocked to drink from the can. And when the mother came, and the mother had come, 600 kilos of plated fury pouring over the wreck line with her whole pack behind her, Wren had been too busy holding the pup to run. She'd looked up, she'd seen death arrive, and she had been so tired and so far from home and so completely out of fear to give that all she'd done was hold the baby up a little and say, "He's okay. I've got him, he's okay." The mother had stopped. Wren still didn't have language for what happened in the next few seconds. The mother had come close enough that Wren felt the heat off her, smelled the iron and ozone of her breath, watched a black eye the size of a fist read her top to bottom. And then the huge head had dipped, taken the pup out of Wren's arms with a delicacy that shamed every careful thing Wren had ever done with her hands, and carried it away. The pack had flowed back into the wrecks, and Wren had sat in the dust shaking for an hour, and then, because she was who she was, had gone back to pulling copper. The pup had come back the next day, on its own, limping on her splint. That was Nettle. Wren set the regulator down and looked at the workshop she'd built out of a gutted ore sorting shed, the forge she'd cobbled from a smelter's guts, the racks, the swept floor, the string of work lamps she kept burning against the canyon cold. She looked at the grown alpha with his chin still on the shed's doorframe, watching the dark. She looked at Nettle asleep in the warm. "This is a very stupid life," she told them both fondly. Neither disagreed. The rumor reached Overseer Drock the way all bad news reached him, sideways and too late to strangle. He was a big Thren, old-blooded, dorsal plates lacquered in the deep concession red, and he had run Ceph-9 for 11 cycles on the principle that fear was cheaper than fencing. You did not need to wall off a hazard if the hazard walled off itself. The gullet killed anything that entered it, therefore the gullet was free security, therefore Drock's clearance budget was mostly a number he moved into other columns. It was an elegant arrangement, and he was fond of it. "Say it again," he told Vesson in the low iron office over the ore docks. "Slower. Because what you said cannot be true, and I want to hear you understand that as you repeat it." Vesson's plates would not lie flat. "The salvage claim is real, Overseer. There is a human working the gullet. She has a shelter, a workshop past the 3rd drag line. And the Corin," he stopped, started again. "The Corin den with her. The Ridge King puts his head on her. There is a pup that follows her like a," he had no Thren word for it, "like a hatchling follows a warm parent." Drock did not move for a long moment. Behind his eyes, Vesson could see the Overseer running the same arithmetic Vesson had run on the ridge, and arriving, as Vesson had, at a total that would not balance. "A human," Drock said, "has tamed the Corin." "I do not think tamed is the word." Vesson heard himself say it and did not know where the courage came from. It did not look tamed. It looked chosen. The beast leaned on her the way you lean on high ground. "That is a poet's answer, and I did not ask a poet." Drock stood. He was a head and a half taller than Vesson, and he used it. "Here is what is true. The Corin are the reason this concession pays me and not some softer creature. The Corin are the fence. If the fence has a gate and a scrap-picking human is standing in the gate handing herself our copper, then I have a hole in my books the size of that canyon. Do you follow?" "Yes, Overseer." "She's stealing, that's all this is. A thief who got lucky with a nesting animal." Drock's throat plates rasped, the Thren version of a decision landing. "We'll pull her out, quietly. Before it becomes a story the crews tell. A human cannot own the gullet. That is not a thing that is allowed to be true." Vesson thought of the great scarred head lowering onto the human's shoulder. He thought of the word evening, said without turning around, "The way you greet family." "Overseer," he said carefully, "if we go into the gullet after her, the Corin will be there." Drock was already looking at his ledgers. "Then bring beasts of our own," he said. "We have a clearance budget, let's finally spend it." The first crew came 8 days later, and Wren heard them before Deacon did, which never happened. She was up on the dragline's boom pulling a sun gear when the sound reached her, the flat industrial whine of a Thren skiff running its repulsors too hard over broken ground, the sound of people who didn't know the canyon and were afraid of it. She looked down. Deacon was already up off the workshop floor, but his head was cocked wrong. He'd caught the engine note and read it as machine, not meat, and machines confused him. He looked to her. That was the thing the Thren would never have believed if they'd seen it. The apex predator of the gullet, in a moment of uncertainty, looked to the human to know what to feel. "Easy," Wren called down. "It's just people being stupid. Let me talk to them." She came down off the boom the way she came down off everything, fast and without ceremony. And by the time the skiff nosed around the third dragline, she was standing in the open in front of her workshop with grease on her hands and a coil regulator still hanging from one hip. Behind her, in the shadow of the shed, 4 Corin had arranged themselves without being told. She could feel them there the way you feel a fire at your back. The skiff set down. 6 Thren came off it, and they were not surveyors. They wore the segmented armor of a clearance team, and 2 of them handled control yokes wired to a cargo pod, and inside the cargo pod, something heavy shifted and struck the walls hard enough to rock the skiff. The lead Thren, a broad one with a scarred snout, looked at Wren and then looked at the 4 Corin in the shadow, and Wren watched him make himself not look at them. "Human," he said through a translator collar. "You're in a restricted hazard zone, concession authority. You'll come with us and answer for the salvage claim. Leave the tools." "I've got a valid claim filed," Wren said. "You can read it. It's got a stamp and everything." "The claim is void. The zone is void. Everything in it is concession property, which by law includes—" His snout twitched toward the shadow, the wildlife. He said the last word like a man laying down a card he thought was a winner. "Step away from the animals and board the skiff." In the cargo pod, the heavy thing struck the wall again, and this time it roared, and the roar was wrong, layered, chemically deepened, a captive sound. Wren's stomach turned over. She knew a fear-conditioned animal when she heard one. Somewhere the Thren kept beasts too and starved them and hurt them into weapons. "You brought a fighter," she said quietly. "You brought a poor tortured thing all the way out here to scare 4 Corin off their own ground." She wiped her hands on her thigh. "You should take it home." "Release the drover," the lead Thren said. The 2 yoke handlers hit their controls, and the cargo pod's face fell open, and the drover came out. It was a Corin. That was the obscenity of it. A Corin, but wrong, a big male gone gray at the plates, one eye milked over, its hide scarred in the flat regular patterns that only ever come from a handler's goad. They'd taken one of the Gullet's own, or one of its cousins from some other stripped moon, and they'd made it into this. A shivering, roaring engine of pain with a control yoke bolted to the base of its skull. It came out of the pod already screaming, already swinging its head to find the thing it had been conditioned to attack, and the yoke lit its nerves up amber down both flanks. Behind Wren in the shadow, Deacon rose to his full height and made a sound she had never heard him make. "Don't," Wren said to Deacon, not the Thren. She said it low and fast and flat. "Deacon." "Wait." And the Ridge King of the Gullet, 600 kilos of muscle and plate with every instinct in him screaming to meet the intruder, stopped at the edge of the lamplight because a human told him to wait. The lead Thren saw it. Wren watched him see it, watched the certainty go out of his stance, watched him understand that the story Vesson had brought back was not a poet's exaggeration, that the beast had not lunged because the human had said a word. She saw him decide in the space of a breath that he did not want to be here. Too late, the drover had found its target, not Deacon, her. It came across the open ground in a low, scrabbling rush, and Wren had time to think, with the strange, slow clarity of such moments, that she was not going to be able to jack this one up and splint it. She had time to plant her feet. She had time to see the milk-white eye and the amber pain running down the poor thing's flanks and to feel, absurdly, sorry for it. She did not have time to be afraid, and afterward she'd think that was the only reason any of it worked, because Corin could smell fear and this one had been trained to chase it, and there was none coming off her. She held up one greasy hand, palm out, the way she'd held up a screaming pup 112 days ago. "Easy," she said, "easy now. Nobody did this to you here." The drover hit the edge of the lamplight and something in it, some deep-buried thing under the conditioning and the pain, heard a voice with no fear in it, standing on Corin ground, smelling of pack and forge smoke and the milk-warm smell that meant den. It faltered. One stride, half a stride. That half stride was all Deacon needed, and this time Wren did not tell him to wait. She would not later describe what the pack did to the drover, because there was nothing in it a person needed to carry. It was fast. It was not cruel. That was the thing the Thren never understood about the Corin, that they had no cruelty in them at all, only decision. When it was over, the drover was still, and the amber light was gone out of the ruined yoke, and the gullet was quiet again except for the tick of the cooling skiff. Deacon walked back to Wren through the settling dust with the poor gray male's blood on his jaws, and he lowered his enormous scarred head, and she put her hand flat on it the way she always did. "You're okay," she told him. "You did right, he's not hurting any more either." Then she turned to the 6 clearance Thren frozen at their skiff, and she was just a young woman in a grease-stained coverall with a coil regulator on her hip, and every Corin in the gullet was standing behind her now, come out of the wrecks silent as weather, and she said the only thing there was to say. "Go home," she said. "Tell whoever sent you the gullet's spoken for." They went home. Wesson had not gone with the clearance crew, and he thanked whatever cold gods the Thren kept that he hadn't. He watched the skiff come back over the ore docks 2 hours early, running crooked, missing its cargo pod and one drover, and a great deal of the swagger it had left with. He watched the lead handler climb out and stand a long time on the dock with his plates flat and his hands shaking, and say nothing to anyone, and go inside. Wesson was a surveyor. His whole training was the reading of ground, where it would hold, where it would give, where the true shape of a thing lay under the reported shape. And he understood, standing on the dock in the cooling evening, that the true shape of Ceph 9 had just shifted under all of them, and that the men in the iron office would spend the next while pretending it hadn't. He requested that night a transfer to the survey of the gullet's margins. It was refused. He filed it again the next morning under a different code, as a hazard mapping necessity, and this time it went through because the man who approved it, Overseer Drock, wanted eyes on the canyon that were not clearance eyes, and did not much care whose. So Wesson got his margin post, a rock shelf above the 3rd dragline, a spotting scope, and orders to log Corin movement. He logged Corin movement. He also, though no code existed to file it under, watched a young human live an impossible life, and slowly, against every instinct his species had bred into him, stopped being afraid. The first thing he learned was that the workshop was never dark. She kept a string of lamps burning all night, every night, hung along the eaves of the gutted shed, and at first he took it for a human weakness, a prey-thing afraid of the dark, keeping the shadows back. Then he watched, 3 nights running, as the Corin used it. Pups too small to hunt would come out of the deep wrecks in the coldest part of the night and pile against the lit shed wall where the forge kept the stone warm, and the lamps would be the thing they steered by, little limping shapes crossing the dark toward the light like ships toward a shore. She wasn't keeping the dark back for herself. She was keeping a light on for them. The second thing he learned was the whistle. Wren didn't think of it as anything. It was 2 notes, high then low, the same 2 notes her grandmother had used to call her in off the levee flats when she was small, and the tide was coming and the light was going. You put 2 fingers to your lip and you dropped the second note like a stone off the first, and it carried. On the flats it had carried half a kilometer over wind. In the gullet, off the canyon walls, it carried the whole 6. She used it at dusk mostly, to bring the young ones in before the cold set. She'd stand in the shed door with the forge warm behind her and the lamps coming up gold against the blue, and she'd whistle high, then low, and the gullet would answer. Not with sound, with movement. All along the wreck line, in the drag lines and the dead hopper trains and the rust caves under the sorting rigs, Corin would lift their heads, and then they would come. Pups first, tumbling, and then the yearlings herding the pups, and then the grown pack drifting in behind like an afterthought that could kill you, and they would flow down the canyon toward the 2 notes and the gold light and the warm. The first time Wesen saw the whole pack answer the whistle, he made a sound into his scope's audio log that the concession's transcription system marked as distress, and that was, in fact, awe. He started, without deciding to think of it as a name, not for the whistle, for what the whistle did. In his private log, the one he kept off the concession net, he wrote it in the old high script his hatch clan still used for things that mattered, the coming home note. He wrote it the way you write down a law you've discovered rather than one you've been taught. Because that was what it was. He had grown up in a culture that was, at its bones, a predator culture. The Thren honored the hunt, ranked by the kill, built their whole hierarchy on who could make whom afraid. And here was a small, unarmed creature from a soft green world who had walked into the one place his people could not hold, and had not conquered it, and had not tamed it, and had instead simply kept a light on, and learned to call, and pulled thorns out of babies. And the apex predators of that place had looked at her and recognized, in a way that went under every plate of Thren pride, something the Thren had spent 10,000 years pretending they were, a true alpha. One who is followed not because she is feared, but because she is trusted to bring the pack home. Wesen filed his required movement logs, and in the high script off the net, he began to write the other thing down, because someone had to, and he had a feeling that someone was going to be him. Drak did not send another clearance crew, because Drak was not a fool, whatever else he was. He did something worse. He filed a report up the concession chain, over Sef-9, to the regional directorate, and in it, he described the Gullet situation in the only frame that protected his budget, not as a marvel, but as a breach. A human squatter had corrupted a hazard control population. Concession beasts, concession copper, concession sovereignty, all of it walking out of the canyon in a scrap picker's cart. He requested authority and materiel to resolve the breach permanently, and he was careful in his phrasing to make the Corin sound like an infestation and the human sound like a disease. The regional directorate did what regional directorates do. It sent an auditor. Her name was Prime Assessor Haux, and she came on a directorate cutter with no clearance team and no beasts and one aide, and she was old enough that her dorsal plates had gone the pale slate of a Thren who has outlived the need to lacquer them red. Drak met her at the docks with the full weight of his authority arranged on his face, and she looked at him the way a surveyor looks at ground she already suspects is hollow. "Show me the breach," she said. "Assessor, the hazard." "You filed 6 pages on the hazard, Overseer. I read them on the way in. They're very frightened pages." Haux started walking, and Drak, to his fury, found himself following her. "I've assessed 40 concessions. Every one of them had a breach that was really a theft, and a theft that was really an embarrassment, and an embarrassment that someone senior had decided to call a hazard so no one would ask him a simple question." She stopped at the cutter's skiff and turned. "So, take me to the canyon. And when we get there, you'll answer the simple question. Is there really a beast problem in the Gullet? Or is there a human doing something you can't afford to be true?" Drak's plates went very still. "Bring the surveyor," Haux added. The young one who won't stop filing off-code addenda. Vesson. He's the only person in your entire concession whose reports read like he's actually been outside. They came into the gullet at midday, on foot from the margin shelf, because HFYStories refused the skiff. I don't assess ground I've never stood on. And Wren met them the way she met everything, walking out of her workshop with grease on her hands and no visible sense that 3 armored aliens on her doorstep were a problem. Deacon met them too. He came up out of the wreck shadow and stood at Wren's shoulder, and Drock took a full step back before he caught himself, and HFYStories did not move at all. She looked at the Ridge King the way she'd looked at Drock, reading him, weighing him, finding the true shape. "You're the human," she said. "Wren Halloran." Wren wiped her hand and after a beat held it out because that was what you did where she was from, and she wasn't going to stop being from there just because she was here. "You're the one they sent to decide whether I'm a problem." HFYStories looked at the offered hand. Thren did not clasp hands. It was a vulnerable gesture, an exposure of the soft wrist. After a moment, deliberately, the old assessor extended her own arm and let the human close warm fingers around her wrist plate. And Vesson, behind them, understood that he had just watched a Directorate Prime assessor do something no Thren of her rank had done in living memory, and do it on purpose, as a test of herself as much as of the human. "That's what I'm here to decide," HFYStories said. "Walk me through it. And Overseer," she didn't turn around, "you'll stay quiet and you'll watch, and if the beast at her shoulder decides to object to you, you'll hold very still and remember that you're the one who wanted to come." Deacon was, in fact, watching Drock, not HFYStories. The Ridge King had sorted the 3 arrivals by some sense the Thren didn't have a name for, and he had decided that the old pale one was allowed, and the young nervous one was allowed, and the big red one was the one who'd sent the drover. Corin memory was long and it ran through the pack. Every beast in the gullet knew the smell of the crew that had brought the poor gray tortured thing, and Drock's skiff had carried that smell, and Drock carried it on him now. He was still and he held it, and he was right to. Wren walked the old assessor through it. Not a speech, she wasn't built for speeches. She just showed her the true shape the way you'd show anyone. Here's the forge. Here's where the pups sleep because the stone stays warm. Here's the splint I made for Nettle before I knew Nettle was going to follow me around forever. She's got a real gait now, see how she's not favoring it. Here's the copper I pull, and here's the log where I file every gram of it against a claim I paid the fee for, which you can read, it's got a stamp. Here's the lamps. No, they're not for me. Watch tonight if you want. They're for the little ones that can't hunt yet. HFYStories watched. HFYStories asked 3 questions in an hour, all of them sharp, none of them frightened. And Nettle, young Nettle, notch-eared, the size now of a full-clearance beast, the pup Wren had jacked out from under a conduit 130 days ago, came and sat down on the assessor's foot, the way she sat on everyone she decided was staying, and looked up at the old Thren with enormous trusting amber eyes. And HFYStories, prime assessor of the regional directorate, 40 concessions assessed, stood very still with a young apex predator's whole weight on her boot and said, in a voice that had gone strange, "She's leaning on me." "She does that," Wren said. "It means she's decided you're allowed." "Allowed," HFYStories repeated. "To come home, to be pack." Wren shrugged and knelt and scratched Nettle under the jaw where the young ones liked it. "It's the highest thing she's got. She hasn't got money or rank to give you. She's just got this. You get to be one of the ones the light stays on for." HFYStories was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, Drock's throat plates worked, and whatever he'd come into the canyon prepared to say died in him, because he could see, as Vesson could see, as anyone with eyes could see, that the assessment was already over. It had been over the moment the young beast chose the assessor's foot. HFYStories stayed 3 days. She would not be talked out of it. She sent her cutter back to orbit and her aide back to the docks, and she stayed in the gullet, in a survey tent Vesson pitched on the margin shelf, and she watched. Drock went back to his iron office with the taste of the visit souring in him, and told himself the assessor was an old woman gone soft, and began, quietly, to make other arrangements. On the shelf, Hawks watched the workshop through Vessen's scope, and asked the young surveyor questions he'd never dared ask himself. "You've been logging this for how long?" 41 days, assessor, on the concession net, longer off it. Off it, Hawks didn't look away from the scope. "Show me the off-net logs." Vessen hesitated. The off-net logs were the high-script ones, the ones where he'd written the coming home note and worse, where he'd written whole pages about what the human was, and what that meant about what the Thren had spent 10,000 years pretending to be. To hand them to a Directorate Prime Assessor was to hand her a rope and his own throat. He handed them over. Hawks read for a long time. The sun went down. Below, the lamps came up gold along the shed eaves, and a two-note whistle carried up the canyon, high then low, and all along the recline the Corrin lifted their heads and began to come home. Hawks watched them come, and read the young surveyor's forbidden pages by the light of a hand lamp, and when she finally set the reader down her old slate plates had a look on them Vessen couldn't name. "You wrote," she said, "that she is what we always claimed to be." "Assessor, You wrote that the Corrin didn't submit to her, that they recognized her. That there's a difference and that the difference is the whole thing." Hawks looked out at the gold light and the gathering pack. "I've assessed 40 concessions, surveyor. I've broken up beast cults and squatter claims and 3 separate frauds involving hazard budgets exactly like Drox. I came out here expecting the 4th, and instead I find," she stopped, started again, and her voice was very old. "When I was young, we still told the Hatch clans the old story, that the Thren were the last true predators. That everything else in the dark was prey pretending. We built an empire on it. And then a soft-handed human walks into a canyon full of the only creatures that ever frightened us, and she doesn't fight them, and she doesn't cage them, and they lie down at her feet, and I understand, watching that we were never the predators in the story. We were the ones so afraid of being prey that we made fear our whole religion." Vessen said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "Drock's going to move on her," Hawks said, abruptly practical again. "He can't afford not to. If she stands, his hazard budget is a fraud, and his fraud is decades deep, and he'll lose everything he's built on being the man the Corrin worked for. He'll wait until I'm gone, and he'll do something that can be blamed on the beasts. An accident. A cull that got out of hand." She stood, joints cracking. "I'm not going to be gone. Log everything, surveyor, on the net and off it. If a prime assessor witnesses it, it's a finding. If a nervous young surveyor witnesses it, it's a story. Drock is counting on there being only stories out here." She almost smiled. "Let's disappoint him." Drock's arrangements took 9 days to assemble, and they came in on a heavy-lift barge under a night cull permit that he signed himself, in his own office, alone. He had learned from the drover. He did not bring one tortured beast this time. He brought a cull package, the kind the concession kept for clearing a whole moon of a hazard population when a seam played out and the beasts became a liability. Sonic drovers to panic the pack. Sealant foam to collapse the rust caves where the pups sheltered. And at the heart of it, a scatter of nerve charges keyed to Corrin physiology, the kind of ugly chemical thing that a man deploys when he wants a canyon full of apex predators to simply lie down and stop. He told the barge crew it was a hazard cull, and it was, legally, exactly that. He did not tell them there was a human in the canyon. He decided in the privacy of the Iron Office that if the human happened to be inside a hazard zone during a lawfully permitted cull, then the concession's liability was, at worst, a form to fill out. Fear was cheaper than fencing. And a cull was cheaper than an assessment that came back saying the overseer of Ceph 9 had spent 11 cycles taking credit for a fence he did not own. He timed it for the deep night. He timed it, he thought, for after the old assessor's cutter had left. The old assessor's cutter had not left. It was sitting dark on the margin shelf with its running lights off, on Hawks's order, and inside it Hawks and Vessen were awake, and the concession net's cull permit alert had lit up on Vessen's reader 40 minutes before the barge crossed the marker line. He filed it, Vessen breathed. He actually filed it. Night cull, full package this quadrant. Assessor, the pup's shelter in the rust caves, and the package includes collapse foam. They'll be. I know what's in the package. Halks was already moving. Get her on a channel. Now. She doesn't have concession comms. She's a scrap picker, she. Then we go down the shelf on foot in the dark and we tell her with our mouths. Halks shrugged into her slate coat. Move, surveyor, and log everything, every second of this. Tonight your off-net habit stops being a habit and starts being evidence. Wren was already awake when they came sliding down the margin scree, because Deacon had woken her. He'd come into the shed and put his nose against her hand where she slept by the banked forge, and he'd made the low sound, the one that meant wrong on the wind, and she'd been up and dressed and out the door before Halk's and Vessen's lamps even cleared the drag line. She stood in the shed doorway with the forge warm behind her and read the canyon the way the Corin were reading it, the far whine of heavy repulsors, the wrong chemical taint sliding down the cold air, the way the whole pack had come up out of sleep and drawn in tight around the workshop with their heads low. There's a lot of them, she said, when the two Thren reached her gasping, coming in from the sea mend, and something in the air I don't like. It's a cull. Vessen got it out between breaths. Drock, a full cull package. Sonics to scatter you, foam to collapse the caves, the pups, Wren, the pups' shelter in the caves, and nerve charges keyed to the Corin. He filed it as a hazard clearance. He's going to gas the canyon, and let the record say the beasts were just beasts. For one moment, one only, Wren Halloran was afraid. Not for herself. Vessen saw it cross her face, and it was the most human thing he'd ever seen. The fear of someone who has a whole family in a burning house and is doing the arithmetic of how many she can carry. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was not the calm he was used to. It was something colder and older, and it made even the Ridge King at her side go still. The pups can't outrun foam, she said, and the grown ones won't leave the pups, so we're not running. She looked at the two Thren. How long? Minutes. The barge is over the marker. Then here's what happens. Wren was already moving, already pulling things off the racks, and her voice had gone flat and fast and certain, the voice of a mechanic who has 3 minutes and a broken machine and is going to fix it or die at it. Vessen, your logs, you keep filming no matter what, you understand me. Whatever happens out there, it doesn't count unless somebody sees it. Assessor, you're a prime whatever, you can talk on their net. When it starts, you get on every channel Drock's barge can hear, and you tell them exactly who's in this canyon. Make them know there's a human here. Make them have to choose to do it anyway. And you, Halks asked. Wren whistled. Not the coming home note. A different one, 3 notes, sharp, rising, one Vessen had never heard, and the effect on the gullet was instantaneous and terrible and beautiful. Every Corin in the canyon stopped drifting and locked. The loose protective knot around the workshop became, in the space of a breath, a formation, the grown pack fanning out into the wrecks in a wide crescent facing the sea mend. The yearlings dropping back to ring the shed, where the pups were being herded in against the warm stone, Deacon rising to the point of the crescent like a blade coming to rest. That one means trouble's coming, Wren said. They've known it since they were pups. I taught it to them the way you teach anything you love how to keep itself alive. She picked up the heavy plasma cutter off the bench, not as a weapon, just as the biggest, brightest thing she had, and she walked out to the point of the crescent to stand at Deacon's shoulder where the pack could see her. Now we make Drock do it in the light. On the barge, Drock watched the canyon come up on his display and saw the lights. He had expected dark. A cull ran best in the dark, on sleeping animals, with the record showing nothing but heat signatures and a hazard closed. Instead, the Gullet's sea mend was lit, a string of gold work lamps along a shed roof, and around it, spread across the wreck line in a shape his tactical readout could not parse, 100 and more core and heat signatures arranged not like a panicked herd, but like a defensive line. "They're formed up," the barge captain said, and his voice had a crack in it. "Overseer, that's beasts don't form up. That's a picket. Something's got them holding a picket." "Something's got them," Drock agreed, and his throat plates were tight. He could see the something. There, at the point of the line, a small bright shape standing at the shoulder of the biggest signature on the board. Standing, not fleeing. Holding the point of a Corin battle line like she'd been born to it. His comm lit. It lit on every channel at once. Override priority, directorate authority, a voice he knew and had gambled would be in orbit. "Barge Keswick, this is Prime Assessor Hawks, Regional Directorate, and I am standing on the margin of the Gullet at this moment as a witness. Be advised, there is a registered human contractor inside your cull zone. Ren Halloran, valid salvage claim, filed and stamped. Be advised that your permit is a hazard clearance authorization and does not, I repeat, does not extend to lethal action against a sentient. Be advised that I am recording. Be advised that every crewman aboard that barge is now personally liable for what happens next, because you have been told, and no one aboard will be able to say they did not know." The barge went very quiet. Drock keyed his own override. "Assessor, with respect, you've been charmed by a squatter and a nesting animal. That's a hazard population down there, lawfully permitted for clearance, and the human chose to trespass in it. Her liability, not ours." He drew a breath. "Captain, deploy the sonics. Scatter the picket. We proceed." "Overseer," the captain began. "We proceed." The sonics came on, and the world became pain. Ren had braced for it, and it was still worse than she'd braced for, a physical wall of sound below hearing, pitched into the marrow, designed to turn a pack into a stampede. She felt it hit the Corin like a tide. She felt Deacon shudder under her hand. She felt the whole crescent buckle, every ancient instinct in every beast screaming, "Run, scatter, flee the sky that hurts." And she did the only thing she had. She whistled the coming home note. High, then low. The two notes her grandmother had used on the levee. She put 2 fingers to her lip and dropped the second note like a stone off the first, and it should have been nothing, a thread of sound under a sonic wall that was breaking the bones of the air, but the Corin were not hearing it with their ears. They were hearing it with the thing the note had made in them over 100 nights of gold light and warm stone and safety. The note meant come home. The note meant the light is on and the den is warm and nothing here will hurt you. The note meant her. The picket held. It held because 100 Corin, in the middle of a sonic attack engineered across decades to be unsurvivable to pack cohesion, chose the humans 2 notes over their own terror. Down the line the great heads came back up. The crescent steadied. Deacon planted his 6 limbs and threw his scarred head back and answered the note with a sound that rolled up the canyon and hit the barge like weather. And all along the wreck line the pack took it up until the Gullet was one voice, and the voice was not fear. On the margin shelf, Vesson filmed it with his hands shaking so hard he had to brace the reader on a rock, and into his audio log he said, without meaning to, in the old high script of his Hatch clan, "They chose her over the pain. God's witness. They chose her over the pain." "Log it," Hawk said beside him, her old voice fierce. "Every frame. He's losing and he doesn't know it yet." Drock knew it. Drock, watching his sonics fail to scatter a picket that no sonic had ever failed to scatter, understood with a cold falling feeling that he had walked his whole career out onto a bridge that was not there. "Foam," he said. "Collapse the caves. If we can't scatter them, we deny them the ground." "Overseer," the human said, the young shelter in the foam the caves. The barge's collapse cannon swung, and this was the part Ren had known was coming and had spent her 3 minutes preparing for, because she was not, in the end, a warrior. She was a mechanic. And a collapse cannon was a machine, and every machine she had ever met had a place where it was stupid. "Deacon," she said, "with me, the rest hold." And she ran not away from the barge, toward it, along the wreck line under the picket, with the Ridge King pouring along beside her and a plasma cutter in her fist, toward the drag line she knew better than she knew her own hands. The old drag line was 600 meters of gantry and cable and dead hydraulics, and it stood between the barge and the Rust Caves, and Wren had spent 140 days pulling copper out of its guts, and knew exactly which of its ancient cables still had tension on them, and exactly where the collapsed cannon's firing arc had to cross under the gantry to reach the caves. She went up the gantry in the dark like she'd been fired from something, Deacon holding the base against the ground crew drones that came skittering, and she reached the tension drum 60 meters up just as the first collapse round went out. She cut the drum. 600 meters of dragline cable, decades under load, let go all at once. The gantry came down across the canyon's throat in a roll of dust and dead steel, and the collapse foam rounds meant for the Rust Caves buried themselves in a mountain of wreckage instead, and the caves with the pups in them, the pups that couldn't outrun foam, stayed open, stayed warm, stayed safe under the fallen bones of the machine the human had spent her whole exile learning to take apart. She rode the gantry halfway down and jumped the last of it into the dust, and came up filthy and whole, and already whistling the coming home note again. And the pack answered, and the barge crew watched a scrap picker collapse their kill zone with a single cut cable, and understood, every one of them, that they were on the wrong side of something. "Nerve charges," Drock said, into a silence that had gone total on the barge. "Deploy the nerve charges." Nobody moved. "Captain, deploy the—" "No, Overseer." The barge captain took off his comm collar and set it on the console, the way a man sets down a thing he does not want to be holding. "There's a human in that canyon," he said. "The assessor's on the net saying so. I don't know what that is down there, Overseer, but it's not a hazard population. Hazard populations run. That thing chose a 2-note whistle over a sonic wall. I've culled beasts for 11 cycles, and I have never once seen a beast choose anything. I'm not going to be the man who gassed it, and I'm not going to be the man who gassed her." He stepped back from the console. "You want the nerve charges deployed, you walk over here and deploy them yourself, and you do it with the assessor recording and my whole crew watching, and then you live the rest of your life as the Thren who did that, sir." Drock looked around the barge. He looked at the crew, none of whom would meet his eyes and none of whom would touch the console. He looked at the display, at the small bright human shape standing again at the point of an unbroken Corin line, filthy, whole, unbothered. A mechanic in a grease-stained coverall who had just taken his entire cull package apart with a cable and a whistle. He looked at the comm channel where a prime assessor was recording every second for a directorate that was going to ask him one simple question. And Drock, who had built 11 cycles on the principle that fear was cheaper than fencing, discovered the flaw in his whole philosophy in the last place he could afford to. That fear only works downhill. And he had just watched a soft-handed human stand at the bottom of a canyon and refuse to be afraid, and take his entire apparatus of fear apart with her bare hands, and that once the crew had seen that it could be done, his fear was worth nothing, and he had nothing else. He did not deploy the nerve charges. He turned the barge around. On the canyon floor, Wren Halloran watched the heavy-lift barge lift off the marker line and turn its ugly bulk back toward the ore docks, and she lowered the plasma cutter she had never once pointed at anyone, and she put her free hand flat on Deacon's heaving scarred flank, and she said the thing she always said. "You're okay," she told the whole canyon, the whole pack, the pups safe in the warm caves and the yearlings ringing the shed and the Ridge King shuddering down out of his fury under her hand. "You did right. We're okay. Come on home." And she whistled the 2 notes, high then low, and the Gullet came home. Drock did not sleep that night, and by the time the sun came up over the ore docks, he had convinced himself he could still win. The barge crew could be reassigned to distant moons. The captain could be recorded as unstable, relieved for cause, his statement filed under the header of a man who'd lost his nerve. The assessor's recording was a problem, but the assessor was one old woman with a reputation for softness, and the directorate ran on convenience, and it would be convenient, so much more convenient, for the gullet to remain a hazard than to become a question. Drock had spent 11 cycles learning that the truth of a thing mattered far less than who was willing to keep saying it. He was willing to keep saying his. He assumed the others would tire. He was still assembling this comfort when Vessen's footage went up on the concession net. Not the directorate net. The concession net, the internal channel every crewman on CF9 read with their morning ration, the board where shift changes and dock assignments and grievances scrolled past. Vessen had not asked permission. He had simply, at dawn, posted the whole thing, the picket holding under the sonics, the two-note whistle threading through the wall of pain, the Corin choosing the human over their own agony, the dragline coming down across the collapsed cannon's arc, the barge turning around. He posted it raw, unedited, with a single line of text under it in plain trade script so no translator could soften it. This is what was in the gullet. This is what the cull was for. By midday, every crew on the moon had seen it. By evening, it had jumped the concession net to 3 other moons. By the end of the 10-day, it was off CF9 entirely, running loose across the directorate's whole region. And the thing about 100 Corin choosing a human's whistle over a sonic wall was that no amount of convenience could make people unsee it. Drock had been right about one thing his entire career. Fear was cheaper than fencing. He had simply never understood that awe was cheaper than both, and that he had just handed the whole region a thing to be in awe of, and that it was not him. The Directorate Tribunal convened on CF9 40 days later, because the region's prime director decided, for reasons of convenience, exactly as Drock had predicted, only the convenience now ran the other way, that the matter was too public to bury and too strange to judge from orbit. They held it in the Ordoc's great receiving hall, the only space on the moon large enough, and it filled. Crews came off shift to stand along the walls. Thren came in from the other moons. And because the tribunal had summoned witnesses, and because the central witness would not leave her canyon undefended and had said so plainly, the tribunal came, in the end, partway to her. They convened at the dock, but they left the great cargo doors open to the Gullet Road, and down that road, at the edge of the lamplight, the Gullet watched. Wren stood in the open doorway between the hall and the road, because that was as far in as she'd come, and as far out as they'd let the beast stay, and it suited her to stand in a doorway anyway. Behind her, in the dark of the canyon road, Deacon lay with his scarred head on his forelimbs and his amber eyes catching the dock lights, and Nettle, grown now past any pup, shoulder-high to Wren, notch-eared and enormous, sat upright beside him like a sentry who had been posted and meant to hold. And behind the two of them, unseen in the dark but felt by every Thren in that hall the way you feel a storm below the horizon, the pack. The prime director was a lean gray Thren named Osseth, and he had read every page of Halk's finding, and he was not a fool either. "Overseer Drock," he said, into a hall gone silent, "you filed a hazard cull permit for a zone you knew to contain a registered sentient. You deployed a sonic array, collapse ordnance, and coring-keyed nerve charges. You did this at night. You did this after a prime assessor of this directorate had personally assessed the zone and instructed you to hold. Do you dispute any of these facts?" Drock stood in the center of the hall in his lacquered red plates, and he had prepared 11 cycles of answers, and he reached for them and found them turned to water in his mouth. Because he could see, over the prime director's shoulder, through the open cargo doors, the young apex predator sitting sentry in the dark, and he could feel the whole watching weight of the canyon behind it, and he understood at last, in his bones, the thing the barge captain had understood on the console, that he was standing in front of a thing that could not be made afraid, and that his entire life had been built on the assumption that everything could. "The human," he said, and his voice cracked, and the crack was heard by every soul in the hall. "The human trespassed in a hazard. The human," said Hawks, from the witness bench unhurried. Filed a valid claim, kept a clean log, and last month stood at the point of a Corin battle line and cut a drag line by hand to keep your collapse foam off a cave full of infant animals. I've assessed 40 concessions, overseer. I have never in my life filed a finding like the one I filed on you. Would you like me to read the part where I estimate how many cycles your hazard budget has been a fraud? Or shall we let the crews in this room, who watched you take credit their whole careers for a fence you never built, do that arithmetic themselves? The hall did the arithmetic. Drock heard it do the arithmetic, a low sound moving along the walls, crew by crew, the sound of a great many people who had been afraid of the gullet their whole working lives, realizing all at once who had taught them to be afraid, and why, and for whose profit. He lost face there. Not the fight had been lost in the canyon. He lost his face in the old thorn sense, the thing his whole culture was built to defend. He stood in a full hall and was seen, plainly and by everyone, to be a small frightened man who had made a religion of other people's fear because he had nothing else, and who had tried to gas a canyon full of babies rather than let a human make him look small, and who had been made small anyway, by a scrap picker with a whistle and a cable, in front of everyone he had ever ruled. The prime director stripped him of the concession in 4 sentences and did not raise his voice to do it. There was no need. The hall had already done the real work. What surprised Wren, what she'd tell Vesson about later, on one of the evenings he took to spending on the margin shelf, was that she felt nothing when Drock fell. Not triumph. Not even relief, really. She'd watched a frightened man be made to see himself, and there was no meat in it for her, nothing a person needed to carry. What she felt, standing in the doorway with the tribunal breaking up behind her and the canyon dark ahead, was Nettle leaning against her leg. The grown cub had come up the road when the crowd started to thin, padding past the last of the thorn, who parted for her without seeming to decide to, and she'd sat down and put her enormous notch-eared head against Wren's hip the way she'd done since she was small enough to carry. And Wren had scratched her under the jaw where she liked it, and looked past her at Deacon, still lying sentinel on the road, and past him at the wreck line where the pack was 100 pairs of amber eyes in the dark, and she'd understood something she hadn't quite had words for before. She hadn't tamed anything. She hadn't won anything. She'd walked into the one place nobody wanted, and she'd kept a light on, and she'd pulled a thorn out of a baby, and everything else, the picket, the whistle, the canyon spoken for, a prime director stripping an overseer in a full hall, everything else had grown from that one small, ordinary decision, the way the whole gullet grew from the one seam that had first cut it. She was not, she thought, anyone special. She was just someone who had been too tired to be afraid on the one afternoon it mattered, and had held a baby up and said he's okay. "Come on," she told Nettle, "we're going home. The little ones'll be cold." And she whistled the 2 notes, high then low, in the doorway of the Ordoc's great hall, in front of the whole assembled directorate of the region. And out on the dark road the gullet answered, the pack rising up out of the wrecks to fold in around her. And every thorn in that hall watched a human walk out into a night full of apex predators as though into her own kitchen, and understood that they had spent 10,000 years being afraid of the wrong thing. The concession changed hands, and then it changed shape, and the change of shape was slower and stranger than anyone had planned for. Osseth, the prime director, did the obvious thing first. He voided the standing cull permits for the gullet, declared the canyon a protected margin, and appointed a warden to administer it. The obvious choice for warden was Hawks, who declined on the grounds that she was too old to live on a rock shelf, and named Vesson instead, over the objections of half the directorate, who felt that a junior surveyor with a habit of filing off-code addenda was not warden material. Hawks's answer to that objection became, briefly, famous across the region. He's the only thorn on this moon who went to the gullet to look instead of to lie about it. That is the entire job. So Vesson became warden of the gullet margin, and moved his post from the rock shelf to a proper prefab station at the head of the canyon road, and set about the work of administering a thing that could not really be administered. You could not, it turned out, put a fence around the gullet, because the Corin came and went as they pleased, and the pups denned where the stone was warm, and none of it answered to a survey line. What you could do, what Wesson did, was stand at the head of the road and decide who was allowed down it. And he decided that with a care that would have surprised the men who'd thought him too junior, because he had watched a young beast choose a prime assessor's foot, and he understood by then that the whole thing turned on the difference between those the light stayed on for and those it didn't. Wren, for her part, did not become anything official. She was offered things: a stipend, a title, a directorate contract to study Corin cohesion phenomena, which she read twice and handed back with grease on it. She did not want to study the Corin. She lived with them. There was no title for that, and she didn't want one invented. What she wanted, it turned out, was work, and the work came to her. It started with a busted repulsor coil on a survey skiff that Wesson couldn't get serviced anywhere on the moon for under a fortune, and Wren fixed in an afternoon for the price of the copper it saved, and it grew from there the way these things grow. A crew found out the Gullet had a mechanic in it who could do precision armature work at scrap prices. Another crew found out she'd take payment in salvage rights or ration credit or an old-fashioned favor, and didn't much care which. And the thing that had kept the Gullet empty for a generation, the terror of the Corin, turned out to be exactly the thing that made her workshop the safest repair bay on Ceph-9, because nobody was going to rob a shed with 100 apex predators denning around it, and nobody was going to shake down a mechanic whose overdue invoice enforcement was a 600-kilo Ridge King who slept in her doorway. So they came. Nervously, at first, a skiff parked at the head of the road, a crewman walking down on foot with his plates flat and his hands visible, escorted the last stretch by Wesson because the Corin still sorted every arrival by smell and memory, and it paid to have the warden vouch. Then less nervously, as the weeks went and nobody was eaten. The Corin, Wren explained to each new white-knuckled customer, did not care about them one way or another as long as they came in the daylight, kept their voices down, didn't running triggered things nobody wanted triggered, and didn't raise a hand to her. That last one especially. They've got a long memory and a short temper about exactly one subject, she'd say, nodding at whatever pup was currently asleep on the customer's boots. And it's me, so we'll get along fine. They got along fine. And the Gullet, which had been a hole in the concessions map for a generation, became, over a season, the one address on Ceph-9 where a Thren could get honest work at a fair price under the guard of the most feared creatures on the moon, and could sit, while they waited, on an overturned crate by a warm forge with a young Corin's head in their lap, and feel, most of them for the first time in their lives, what it was to be near the thing you'd been raised to fear, and have it choose to be gentle with you. Wesson watched them come out of the canyon changed. He watched hard dock crew Thren, men who'd carried clearance goads their whole careers, come out of an afternoon in the warm bay quiet and thoughtful, a little embarrassed, unable to explain to their shiftmates why their eyes were wet. He logged it in the high script off the net, because it was the truest thing happening on the moon and no code existed to file it under. He was building, without quite deciding to, a record of a species changing its mind about itself one afternoon at a time, and he had a feeling that record was going to matter more than anything the directorate would ever ask him for. The Vane gliders came in the second season, and their coming was the thing that made Wren finally understand what she'd built. She'd known about them the way you know about weather at the edge of the map. The Corin had a wariness about the high canyon walls at dusk, a way of moving the smallest pups under cover when a certain shadow crossed the last light, and once or twice she'd seen the shadow itself, a long-winged shape riding the thermals off the sun-warmed rock, patient, circling, Vane gliders, a different apex entirely, aerial, venom-spurred, solitary by nature, the Corin's one true rival for the Gullet's sky. They did not den. They did not pack. They hunted the high air alone and came down like a thrown blade, and they were, by every account Wesson could find, untamable in a way that made the Corin look domestic. One of them came down wrong at the end of a hard winter. Wren found it at the foot of the west wall at first light. A young one, its left wing frame snapped and fouled where it had struck a wreck spar in the dark, its venom spurs flexing in helpless fury, and every corn in the canyon giving it a wide and watchful berth because a downed vein glider was still, even broken, one of the most dangerous things on the moon. It screamed at her when she came close, a thin scything sound, nothing like a corn, and it struck at her with its good wing and its spurs, and it would have killed her if it could, and it could not because it was broken, and it knew it was broken. And under the fury there was the thing Wren had learned to hear under every furious hurt creature she'd ever met: terror and pain and the certainty of dying alone. She'd stood a long time out of its reach in the cold first light, and she'd thought about how a wing frame wasn't so different from a dragline gantry, and how a splint was a splint whatever it braced, and how the sensible thing, the thing anyone would tell her to do, was to walk away and let the canyon settle its own accounts. Then she'd gone back to the shed for her longest clamps and a coil of hydraulic line, and Deacon had risen to come with her, and she'd told him to stay, because this she had to do the way she'd done the very first one, alone and unafraid and close enough to die. "Easy," she'd said, kneeling just inside the spur's reach, palms open, forge smoke and pack smell and no fear at all coming off her. "Easy now, I've done this before. Nobody did this to you here." It took the whole morning. It took more nerve than the picket had, because the picket she'd faced with 100 Corin at her back, and this she faced with nothing but her voice and her hands. But a broken wing frame is a mechanical problem, and Wren Halloran had never once in her life met a mechanical problem she'd walk away from, and by midday the young vein glider lay splinted and exhausted, and the thing that made Vesson, watching from the road with his heart in his throat, set down his reader and simply stare quiet under her hands, its scything scream gone still, its venom spurs folded. A second apex of a second kind, of a species that packed with no one and trusted nothing, lying in the dust of the gullet with a human splint on its wing and a human's palm flat on its heaving side, choosing, exactly as the Corin had chosen, to believe the voice with no fear in it. It did not leave when it healed. That was the thing. It flew again by the next moon, tested the wing on the thermals and found it held, and it stayed. It took to roosting on the high spar above the shed, a long-winged sentinel over the whole canyon, and when the coming home note went up at dusk, it would drop off the spar and ride the sound down the way the Corin came up the road, and the pups learned its shadow was a friend's shadow, and the gullet had two kinds of apex in it now, denning under one light. "That's not supposed to be possible," Vesson said that night on the margin, watching the glider settle onto its spar as the pack came home beneath it. "Corin and vein gliders don't share ground. They kill each other over sky. Every survey of every stripped moon in the region says so." "They don't share ground," Wren agreed, banking the forge. "They share her." She said it plainly, without weight, the way she said everything, but Vesson heard it land. "Whatever the note means to them, home, safe, the lights on, it's bigger than what they are to each other. I didn't make them get along. I just gave them both the same place to come home to." She looked up at the two shapes overhead, the winged one, and on the road the great scarred one lying sentinel. "Turns out that's most of what anybody needs. Same place to come home to." Vesson's record was what brought the wrong people in the end, and he would carry that quietly for a long time before Wren made him put it down. The record had done good work. The high-script logs, the raw footage, the season of afternoons, Hawks had taken all of it to the directorate, and it had changed things, real things, across the region. 2 other stripped moons had their cull permits reviewed. A Hatch clan on the far side of the system began teaching the old story differently, with the ending changed. The phrase Vesson had coined off the net, the one he'd been almost ashamed of, had gotten loose the way the footage had gotten loose, and now Thren, who'd never been within a system of the Gullet, spoke of the coming home note as though it were a real doctrine, an old law rediscovered. The idea that an alpha is not the one the pack fears, but the one the pack trusts to bring it home. It had started to mean something. It had started, in small ways, to change a predator culture's mind about what a predator was for. But a record that shows 100 apex predators holding a picket under a sonic wall is not only an inspiration. To the right kind of eye, it is a specification. The right kind of eye belonged to an outfit called the Sable Reach Provisioning Group, which was a clean name for a dirty trade, the supply of living weapons to buyers who preferred not to be named. Sable Reach did not deal in tamed animals. Tamed animals broke. Sable Reach dealt in bonded ones, beasts conditioned to a single handler, loyal past pain, the kind of asset a border warlord or a corporate security arm would pay a fortune for. And Sable Reach's acquisitions officer, watching Vessen's leaked footage in an office 4 systems away, saw 100 Corin choose a 2-note whistle over a sonic wall engineered to be unsurvivable, and did not feel awe. He felt appetite. His name was Coral Ven, and he was not a Thren. He was something colder-blooded and better financed, a species Ren never got a clean word for, and he did not make Drock's mistake. He did not send a clearance crew. He did not file a cull permit. He came to Ceph-9 himself, quietly, on a chartered hull with clean papers, and he presented himself at the head of the Gullet Road as a buyer. A collector of exotic salvage, he said, interested in the canyon's famous mechanic and her famous workshop. And he was patient, and he was charming, and he was, Vessen realized far too slowly, taking a survey. He asked about the note, Vessen said, coming down the road at dusk with his plates tight. 3 times, casually, what it was, whether anyone else could sound it, whether the beasts answered it or answered her. He asked how many pups were in the canyon this season. He asked which ones were weaned. He stopped. Ren, he's not a collector, he's counting inventory. Ren set down the coil she was winding. Behind her in the shed door, Deacon lifted his gray head. He was older now, there was more gray in his plates than black, and he moved slower on the cold mornings, and Nettle had grown past him, half a head taller at the shoulder, the biggest Corin in the gullet and getting bigger. But the Ridge King lifted his head at the change in Ren's stillness the way he always had, reading her, and what he read brought him up onto his feet. Weaned, Ren repeated. He asked which pups were weaned. Yes. Because a weaned pup can be shipped and an unweaned one dies in transit. She'd gone very quiet, and it was the quiet Vessen had learned to be afraid of, the cold old quiet that had come over her the night of the cull. He wants to take cubs, bond stock. He watched your footage and he thinks, what? That he can raise them to a handler the way I raised Nettle, that he can bottle the note. Can he? Vessen asked, before he could stop himself. No, Ren picked the coil back up, but she wasn't winding it now, just holding it, and her knuckles were white. You can't bottle it. It isn't a trick. It's 100, and how long have I been out here, Vessen? 3 years, near enough. It's 3 years of keeping a light on. 3 years of never once being the thing they were afraid of. You can't buy that, and you can't ship it, and you can't beat it into a cub with a goad. But a man like that won't believe me, because a man like that has never in his life kept a light on for anything. He'll just take the cubs and try, and they'll break, the way tamed things break, and he'll throw them away broken and come back for more. She looked up, and her plain, tired face had something in it that Vessen had only seen once before, on the night she cut the drag line. He's going to come in the dark for the weaned pups. When's he leaving the moon? He booked passage out on the 10-day tide. Then he'll move before then. Ren stood. Go tell Haux. Go tell Osseth. Get me every eye you can on that man, official ones, the kind that make a record, because I'm not going to be able to stop him gently. And when it isn't gentle, I want the whole region watching, the same as last time. I want it done in the light. Coral Ven moved on the 8th night, and he did it well because he was good at his trade. He did not bring a barge or a cull package. He brought 6 of his own operatives, professionals, in dampened suits that ran cold to fool the Corin's heat sense, and a whisper skiff that came in over the high wall with its repulsors cut, riding the dusk thermals down into the canyon on dead sticks the way the vein gliders rode them. He'd studied. He knew the pack denned close around the shed and picketed the road. He knew the pups sheltered in the rust caves. He knew the humans sounded a note at dusk, and the whole canyon came home to it, which meant that at dusk, for a little while, the beasts were converging inward, toward the light, away from the caves at the canyon's far end where the weaned pups of the season had their own smaller den. So he did not go near the shed at all. He put his skiff down soft at the far end, in the dark, while the coming home note was still echoing off the walls, and every Corin in the gullet was flowing the other way toward the gold light, and his cold-suited operatives went into the far caves with capture loops and sedative lances to take the 4 weaned pups of the season, quietly, and be gone over the wall before the pack ever knew the canyon had been opened. It was a good plan. It failed for a reason Coral Ven had no way to survey, because it was not in any footage and not in any log, and it was this. The vein glider did not come home to the note. The vein glider came home to her. It roosted high over the shed, and it hunted the high air alone the way its kind always had, and it did not flow with the Corin toward the light because it was not Corin. It simply watched from the spar the whole canyon at once, the way a thing that owns the sky watches. And it saw in the last blue light a shape that was wrong, a skiff riding dead thermals down into the dark far end where nothing should be flying, cold running, quiet. A hunter that was not the human's hunter, coming down into the den from above the way the glider itself came down on prey. It did not sound an alarm because it was not a pack animal and did not have one. It did what it was. It folded its long wings and it fell off the spar in a silence more total than the skiff's, and it went down the length of the canyon like a thrown blade. And the first Coral Ven's operatives knew of the gullet's third apex was a scything shape out of the last light, and a sound above hearing, and the sudden, absolute certainty that they were not the hunters here. Wren heard the glider go. She knew its sounds by then the way she knew the packs, knew the lazy sheer of it settling on the spar at dusk, knew the wind noise of it testing the thermals, and knew, the instant it happened, the sound she had never once heard it make. The hard, fast drop, the wings folding, the whistle of a body committing to a dive down the length of the canyon toward the dark far end. It was a hunting sound, and there was nothing in the far caves worth hunting but 4 weaned pups asleep in the warm. She was moving before she'd finished the thought. Vesson, the far caves, someone's in the far caves. She was already through the shed door, already reaching for the thing she reached for at moments like this, which was not a weapon, which had never once been a weapon but her voice. She put 2 fingers to her lip, and she sounded the note she had only ever sounded twice before, the 3 sharp rising notes, troubles coming, and the gullet came apart and reformed around it. Deacon was up. Old and gray and slow on the cold mornings, the Ridge King came off the shed floor like something 30 years younger and threw the trouble note back down the canyon in a roar that shook grit off the walls. And the pack, flowing inward toward the coming home light not a minute before, turned as one animal and poured the other way, toward the far caves, toward the dark, toward the sky shape that had fallen on their young. And at the head of them passed the old king, faster and taller and terrible, went Nettle. Vesson, running behind Wren with his reader up and recording, because she'd trained that into him the way she'd trained the notes into the pack, saw the grown cub go by in the near dark, and felt the years turn over in his chest. He had watched Wren jack a screaming pup out from under a conduit with a hydraulic splint. He had watched that pup limp back the next day on the splint, alone, choosing her. He had watched it grow through 3 winters, notch-eared, from a thing she could carry to a thing that carried the whole canyon's future in the width of its shoulders. And here it was at the point of the pack, past its own aging king, going down into the dark to guard the den it had once been a helpless part of, and Vesson understood he was watching the whole story fold shut on itself. The rescued become the rescuer, the guarded become the guard. Log it, Wren said, running, not looking back, all of it in the light. There was not much light. But there was enough, because Coral Ven's operatives, in the moment the glider fell on them, did the one thing Wren had spent 3 years teaching the pack that people did when they were about to die. They panicked, and they lit their lamps and they ran. What happened in the far caves happened fast, and Wren arrived at the end of it, and it was, mercifully, not the thing it could have been. The vain glider had not killed anyone. It had done something worse for a professional. It had unmade the plan. It had come down out of the sky in total silence and taken the capture loops out of 2 operatives' hands and driven the whole cold-suited team back out of the cave mouth into the open, spurs flashing, wings cracking like sails, herding them the way it would herd prey it wasn't hungry enough to finish. And it had held them there, in the open, in the dark, lit by their own dropped lamps, for the 30 seconds it took the pack to arrive. And then the pack arrived, and the operatives, who had trained cold and studied the footage and dampened their heat and done everything right, learned the thing that no footage could teach, that a Quarren pack converging on a threat to its pups in the dark is not a hazard population. It is a judgment. It came down the canyon and it closed around them, and it did not scatter and it did not hesitate. And at the point of it was a young Ridge King half a head taller than the last, notch-eared, moving with the terrible economy Wren had watched grow in her over 3 years. And the operatives dropped their lances and their loops and their dampened pride, and they did the last thing left to them, which was to freeze, and to be, for the first time in their well-paid lives, prey. Nettle, Wren's voice came out of the dark, flat and fast and absolutely certain, the voice that had held a picket under a sonic wall. Nettle. Wait. The young Ridge King stopped, one stride from the nearest man, her whole enormous body vibrating with the drive to finish it, and she stopped because a human told her to wait, the same way the old king had stopped at the edge of the lamplight 3 years before. The pack stopped with her. 100 Quarren and a vain glider and a canyon's worth of coiled judgment, held on a single word in the dark, over 6 operatives who had come to steal children. Wren walked into the middle of it. She walked through her own pack the way she walked through everything, without ceremony, and she picked up one of the dropped lamps and held it up so the record Vesson was making would have light, and she looked at the 6 cold-suited professionals frozen in the ring of beasts, and she was just a tired woman in a grease-stained coverall who had been woken from banking her forge. "You came for the weaned ones," she said. "It wasn't a question. Bond stock. You watched a video of my family holding a line under a sound that was made to break them, and you thought you could buy that, or steal it, or beat it into a cub with a goad and sell it to somebody who wanted a loyal thing to point at his enemies." She shook her head, slow, and there was no triumph in it, only a bone-deep weariness. "You can't, I keep trying to tell people. It isn't a trick and it isn't for sale. It's just a light left on. But you'd have taken these 4 babies and broken every one of them finding that out, so." She looked past them up the dark canyon to where a chartered hull sat waiting on clean papers with a man in it who had never in his life kept a light on for anything. "Where's the one who sent you? Where's Ven?" None of them answered. They didn't have to. The vain glider answered, dropping off the cave rim with a sound like a sail tearing, and went up the canyon toward the far end where a whisper skiff sat on dead sticks with its cold engines ticking, and Wren, watching it go, said the only thing there was to say. "Trouble's coming," she told the pack. "Go see him home." And she sounded the 3 notes, and the gullet went to find Coral Ven. He did not get over the wall. Wren was told the rest of it later by Vesson, who was told it by the whisper skiff's pilot who lived, because Wren had sounded a 4th note when the pack reached the far end. A single long low note none of them had heard. The note she'd never had to use, the one that meant enough, and the pack had heard it through their fury and obeyed it, and had not torn the skiff apart with the men inside. That was the thing about the gullet that Coral Ven's survey could never have caught, the thing that separated it from every bonded weapon operation Sable Reach had ever run. The beasts did not only know the note that meant kill, they knew the note that meant stop. They knew it because the human who taught them had never once wanted them to be weapons, and a weapon does not know how to stop, And that was the whole difference. And it was the difference Coral Ven had crossed 4 systems to steal and would now spend the rest of his life explaining to a directorate tribunal. Because Wren had gotten her wish, it was done in the light. Vessen's record ran the whole thing, cave to wall, and Hawks had at Wren's asking days before, when the counting of inventory first started, arranged for it to run live. Not leaked this time but broadcast, directorate witnessed, to a region that had spent 3 years learning the coming home note and now watched its meaning proven in the dark. 100 apex predators converging on men who'd come to steal their young, and stopping, all of them, every one, on a single note from a tired woman with a lamp, 1 stride short of the thing everyone expected of beasts. The region did not see a hazard. The region saw a family defended and a mercy chosen, and it saw the man who'd come to buy that family as bond stock hauled out of a canyon he'd thought he was surveying, and it made up its mind about Coral Ven and Sable Reach and the whole clean-papered trade in loyal broken things in about the time it takes to lose a face. Oseth came out to the Gullet himself after the Ven tribunal, which no prime director had ever done, and he came the way Hawks had taught the directorate to come, on foot, down the road in the daylight, with his hands visible and Vessen walking him the last stretch so the pack could sort him by smell. He brought a document. Wren read it standing in her shed door with a young pup asleep on her boots, and it was, for a directorate document, remarkably short. It granted the Gullet the status of a protected commons in perpetuity, unownable and unsurveyable, administered by a warden answerable to the directorate but not to any concession, closed to all extraction and all culling and all trade in its animals forever. It named the canyon, in the formal register, not by its survey code, but by the name the crews had started calling it on their own, the Warm Bay. And at the bottom, in a clause Oseth had clearly fought his own directorate to include, it recognized one Wren Halloran human contractor as the keeper of the Warm Bay. Not its owner, the document was careful. You could not own the Gullet, but the one the light stayed on for, made official in the flat language of an interstellar authority that had spent 10,000 years having no language for such a thing and had just for her invented one. You don't have to sign it, Oseth said. The protection stands either way. Hawks made sure of that. The keeper clause is... The old gray Thren paused, and Wren watched him reach for honesty and find it's for us mostly, not for you. We needed to write it down. We needed it in the register that a human did this. And how? So that the next Hatch clan that gets taught the old story gets taught the true ending, and not the one we told for 10,000 years. He looked out at the canyon, at the pack drowsing in the afternoon warmth, at the Vane glider on its high spar, at the old gray Ridge King lying sentinel by the road. We told our young that we were the last true predators and everything else was prey pretending. You walked into the worst place on this moon and proved we had it backwards, that the last true predator isn't the one nothing will stand against. It's the one everything wants to come home to. He almost smiled. That's worth a clause. Sign it or don't. It's true either way. Wren signed it. Not for the title, which she'd never use and never did. She signed it because of the part about the next Hatch clan getting the true ending, because a light left on is only worth anything if you leave it on for the ones who come after, and a story told right is the longest burning light there is. Then she offered the prime director of the region a cup of the terrible synth tea she brewed on the forge, and he drank it sitting on an overturned crate with a Corin pup asleep across his boots, and Vessen logged that too, off the net, in the high script, because it was the truest thing that had happened on Ceph 9 in 10,000 years, and there was still no code to file it under. The Thren made a religion of her habits, and Wren never could break them of it, and after a while she stopped trying. It started with the splint kit. She kept one by the shed door, a roll of hydraulic line and a few clamps and a water flask, the same simple things she'd used on the first pup, because pups got themselves stuck in the wrecks the way pups did, and it saved time to have it where a hand could reach it. That was the whole of it. It was a mechanic keeping her tools where she'd need them. The dock crews who came for repairs decided it was a sacred thing. Wren first understood the scale of the misunderstanding when a hard old dragline foreman named Kest, a thren who'd carried a clearance goad for 30 cycles and had cried, quietly and to his own bafflement, the first afternoon a pup fell asleep on his boots, asked her with enormous gravity whether he was permitted to look at the kit. Permitted. It said sure. It's just line and clamps, help yourself. And Kest had approached it the way a priest approaches an altar and studied it in silence and gone back to his moon. And she learned much later, made one exactly like it for the pens where his own crews kept their hazard beasts, and hung it by the door, and told his crews that the beasts in their charge were to be mended before they were ever again goaded, because that was the keeper's way, and the keeper's way was the way that had emptied the gullet of its fear. They gave it a name because the thren gave everything that mattered a name in the old high register. They called the splint kit by the door, and the practice it stood for, the mending hand. Wren heard the phrase come back to her a season later from a crew 4 moons distant, and had to go sit down for a while, because she had not found it a doctrine. She had put a roll of line by a door, and somewhere out in the cold, a species that had built 10,000 years of empire on who could make whom bleed was teaching its young, that the highest law was to mend a thing before you ever raised your hand to it, and they were calling it the mending hand, and they thought she'd meant it. I didn't mean anything, she told Vesson helplessly. It's a first aid kit. I know, Vesson said, and he was writing it down in the high script off the net, with a look on his plated face she'd learned to read as joy. That's why it's holy. You didn't mean anything. You just did the kind thing because it was nearest to hand and you never once thought it was remarkable. Do you understand what that does to people who spent their whole history believing kindness was a weakness you performed and cruelty was the true nature underneath? You showed them a person for whom the kind thing was simply the nearest thing, that it could be a reflex instead of a struggle. Wren, that's the whole revolution. That's everything. Of course they named it. It didn't stop with the kit. They named the lamps. The string she kept burning against the cold became, in the mouths of the crews, the watch that does not sleep, and lamp watch duty spread off the gullet to the pens on other moons, keepers sitting up through the cold hours so no hazard beast would wake alone in the dark. They named the synth tea, which Wren thought was a joke until she realized it wasn't. The terrible bitter stuff she brewed on the forge and pressed on every white-knuckled customer who came down the road became a rite of passage. The first cup, the thing you drank sitting by the forge with a pup on your boots on the day you stopped being afraid of the canyon. And hard old Thren spoke of the day they took the first cup the way soldiers speak of a battle they survived. And they named her Walking. The way she moved through the pack without ceremony, without armor, without ever once looking to see whether it was safe. The crews watched her do it and could not do it themselves. Not yet. And they gave the thing they could not yet do a name so their children might grow into it. And the name was the unarmored walk. And it meant to go among the ones you'd been taught to fear as though there were nothing to fear. Because there wasn't. Because fear was the only thing that had ever made them dangerous. Wren thought all of it was faintly ridiculous and said so, often, to no effect whatsoever. But she noticed, she couldn't help noticing, that the moons where the crews had taken up her ridiculous named habits were the moons where the cull permits stopped getting filed. The mending hand emptied the pens. The unarmored walk emptied them further. A generation of Thren who'd have grown up carrying goads grew up carrying splint kits instead, and the beasts of a dozen stripped moons stopped being hazards and started being, slowly, the way the Gullet's own had, something closer to kin. And if that took a little ridiculous ceremony, a few solemn names in the old high register for the plain small kindnesses of one stranded mechanic, then Wren decided she could live with being ridiculous. She'd been called worse. She'd been called a squatter and a thief and a hazard, and a fool, and worse than a fool by the men who'd wanted the canyon to stay a graveyard, and she had outlived every one of the names and gone on working straight through them without once looking up. The mending hand was an improvement, and it kept the light on farther than her 2 notes ever could carry, and in the end that was the only measure she'd ever cared about. "Name whatever you want," she told Kest. The last time the old foreman came down the road, gone gray himself by then, to sit by the forge and take a cup he'd taken 100 times. "Just keep mending them before you goad them, and keep the light on, and teach your young ones to do the same. That's all any of it ever meant. The rest is just words." She refilled his cup with the terrible tea. "But I'll tell you the truth, Kest, since you came all this way. It's better with the words. I didn't think so at first, I think so now. A thing you can name is a thing you can hand to your children, so name it, name all of it. Just don't ever forget it started with a roll of line by a door and anybody at all could have picked it up. That's the part that matters, not that I did it, that anybody could." Kest carried that back to his moon too, and it went into the charter of the pens there, under the mending hand in the high register, word for word. Anybody at all could have picked it up. That is the part that matters. The passage home came a season later, and Wren almost didn't tell anyone she'd turned it down. It was a real offer this time, not a scam berth like the one that had stranded her, but a directorate charter paid. A clean seat on a clean hull all the way back to the green world she'd left at 23 and hadn't seen in 4 years. Osseth arranged it, quietly, as a kindness, because it had occurred to him that in all the writing down of what Wren had done for the Thren, nobody had once asked whether she wanted to go home. She was, after all, a young woman a very long way from where she'd started. She had family back there, or had had. She had a whole life she'd stepped out of one afternoon to jack a screaming pup out from under a conduit, and never quite stepped back into. Wesson was the one who brought her the charter, and he brought it with his plates flat because he'd done the arithmetic and he knew that if she took it the light would go out. Not the lamps, someone could hang lamps. The note, the thing under the note. You could not hand the coming home note to a new warden the way you handed over a document. It wasn't a trick. She'd said so herself 100 times. It was 3 years of never once being the thing they were afraid of, and it lived in her, and it would leave with her, and the Gullet would go back to being a hole in the map with a family in it that trusted no one because the one they'd trusted had gone home. Wren read the charter twice. She looked at it a long time. And Wesson watched her look, at the clean seat and the green world and the whole life she'd stepped out of, and he did not say anything, because it was not his to say, and because he could not have kept his voice steady. Then she folded the charter up and set it on the bench under the coil regulator, where it would slowly gather grease and dust and become, over the next while, just another piece of paper in a workshop full of them. "Deacon's getting old," she said, by way of answer, which was not an answer to the question Wesson had asked but was an answer to the real one. "He won't see another 2 winters. Maybe not 1. She was watching the gray Ridge-King out on the road, the way he lay a little longer in the mornings now, the way the cold got into his old joints, the way Nettle had taken to lying down beside him and taking the wind so he could sleep in the lee of her. "I pulled his splint on the first day I was here, not his daughter's, but he was there. He watched me do it. He was the one who came over the wreck line and stopped. 3 years I've had him. I'm not going home for the last 2 winters of the first friend I made in this whole system. That's not," she stopped and shrugged plainly the way she did everything. "You don't leave before the light's ready to be passed. And it isn't, not yet. Nettle's close, she's not there, so I'm staying till she is." "And when she is?" Wesson asked very quietly. Wren looked at the green world's name on the folded charter under the grease, and then at the canyon that had become, somewhere in 3 years of kept lights, the only place she'd ever felt was hers. "Ask me then," she said. But they both knew the answer, and the answer was in the workshop's swept floor and the sorted racks and the string of lamps she'd hung against the cold 4 years ago and never once let go dark. And the answer was that some people go looking for home their whole lives, and a very few of them, once or twice in a generation, are lucky enough and stubborn enough to build one in the last place anyone would look, out of scrap and patience and a light left on. And that Wren Halloran was not going to leave the home She'd built to go back to one that had stopped being hers the afternoon she picked up a jack and a torch and walked into the gullet. Deacon lived through that winter, and most of the next, and he went in the spring, on a warm morning in the sun, which was the one mercy Wren had asked the cold gods of that place for, and the one they gave her. He had been failing for a 10-day, slow and without pain, the way a strong old thing fails when it has finally decided the work is done. He'd stopped hunting. Nettle brought him meat, laid it down before him the way he'd once laid it before pups, and he took what he wanted of it, and mostly he slept in the sun by the shed door where the forge kept the stone warm, in the lamplight at night, with the whole pack rearranged around him the way a pack rearranges around its old. The young ones giving him the warmest ground, the yearlings keeping the wind off, Nettle never more than a few strides from his side. On the last morning, Wren sat with him. She had a coil in her lap she wasn't winding and her back against his great gray flank, feeling the slow tide of his breathing, and she talked to him the way she'd talked to him for 4 years, low and easy and about nothing, the weather, the pups, the busted repulsor on the survey skiff she'd fixed that afternoon, the terrible synth. He listened the way he always had, with one amber eye half open and his scarred head near her hand. And when the breathing slowed and lengthened and began, gently, to space itself out toward the last of it, she did not weep and she did not go quiet. She kept talking. She kept her voice easy and unafraid, because that was the gift she had, the only one, the thing that had stopped a mother on the wreck line 4 years ago and held a picket under a sonic wall and turned a canyon of killers into a family, a voice with no fear in it, for the ones who were afraid. "You did right," she told him, her hand flat on the old gray head the way it had been 10,000 times. "The whole time, every bit of it. You stopped when I asked and you came when I called and you kept them all safe and you let a fool of a human make a home in your canyon and there was never once anything to be afraid of and there isn't now. You're okay. You hear me, old man, you're okay. Go on and rest. The light's on. It'll stay on. I've got them." And Deacon, the Ridge King of the Gullet, the first friend Wren Halloran made in that whole cold system, the beast that should have killed her on the wreck line and had instead leaned his tired head on her, because she was the thing his whole long, dangerous life had been looking for, a place to come home to, let out his breath in the sun, in the lamplight, in the lee of the daughter of his line, with a human's unafraid voice in his ear and a human's hand on his head, and did not take another. Wren sat with him a long time after. Then she sounded the coming home note, high then low, soft as she'd ever sounded it, and the whole gullet came in from the wrecks in the warm spring sun to lie down around their old king one last time. And at the point of them where he had lain for 4 years, the new Ridge King took her place, notch-eared and enormous, and lay down in the sun beside the human, and set her great head down on Wren's shoulder, gently, the way a tired thing leans on the only thing it trusts. "Evening, Nettle," Wren said, though it was morning, and the light was past. The years after that ran together the way good years do, and the gullet changed again, more slowly, into the thing it would be for the rest of Wren's life. Nettle proved a different kind of Ridge King than Deacon had been. Deacon had ruled by being the largest and the oldest, and by having survived the most. Nettle ruled the way she'd been raised, which was to say she ruled by the note, by the light, by the memory older than her own life of being jacked out from under a conduit by a human who wasn't afraid of her. She was, if anything, gentler with the pups and harder on the boundary than the old king had been. She'd learned protection at the point of a picket, and she never forgot it. And she took to lying in the shed door at night the way Deacon had, so that the first thing any arrival down the road saw was the notch-eared silhouette of the largest Corin anyone had ever measured, unmoving, watching, with a string of gold lamps burning above her and a human working a forge at her back. The warm bay became, over those years, something none of them had set out to build. Word had gotten too far to stay a story. It became a place. Thren came from off-moon and then from off-system, not to steal anything and not to study anything, but simply to see it, to walk down the road under Vessen's careful eye, in the daylight, with their hands visible, and sit on an overturned crate by the forge and feel a Corin pup fall asleep on their boots, and understand, most of them for the first time in their lives, that the thing their whole culture had taught them to fear could choose to be gentle, and that the choosing was the highest thing an apex had to give. They came hard and they left soft. Wesen logged every one of them. His record, the high-script one he'd kept off the net for years, was finally published entire. Hawks insisted on it, near the end, and it became, improbably, the most read document in the region's history, taught to hatch clans, argued over by philosophers, quoted by directors. The account of the season a predator species watched a soft-handed human keep a light on in the worst place on a stripped moon, and slowly, one afternoon at a time, changed its mind about what it was for. Hawks did come to the canyon in the end, when she was too old for the directorate and the directorate too grateful to refuse her anything. She lived her last 2 years in a prefab beside Wesen's warden station, and she spent her mornings on the margin shelf with the same scope she'd handed the young surveyor a lifetime before, watching the pack come home to the note, and she said once, to Wren, on one of the evenings Wren climbed up to sit with her, that she'd assessed 40 concessions and broken up a dozen frauds and audited half the region, and that the only thing she'd ever done that she was sure had been worth doing was refusing to leave the Gullet the night of the call. "You'd have one without me," she told Wren, watching the gold light come up along the shed eaves far below. "No," Wren said, which was the truth and not modesty. "You made them do it in the light, that was the whole thing. Anybody can hold a canyon. It's making them watch you do it that changes anything." She was quiet a while. "You want to know the truth, I couldn't have done any of it if you and Wesen hadn't kept writing it down. A light nobody sees might as well be off. You two are the reason it carried past the wreck line." Hawks died that winter, in the canyon, in the sound of the coming home note, and the Gullet came in from the wrecks to lie down around her prefab the way it had lain down around its old king, because by then the pack had long since decided the old pale thorn was one of the ones the light stayed on for. Wren buried her on the margin shelf, above the third dragline, in sight of the scope and the shed and the whole canyon, and put no marker on it, because Hawks had asked for none. "The record's the marker," the old assessor had said. "Leave the ground clean, let something den in it." Something did. A Corin bitch raised a litter in the lee of the grave the next spring, and Wren decided that was as good a monument as the region was ever going to build to the prime assessor who'd made them do it in the light, and let it be. The first other humans reached the Ceph system in Wren's 9th year in the Gullet, and the way the thorn braced for it told her, more than anything else had, how far the story had traveled and how strangely it had landed. She heard about the ship before she saw anyone, heard it from Wesen, who came down the road with a look she hadn't seen on him in years, the flat-plated look of a thorn confronting something his whole culture had an old fear of. A human vessel, a real one, a survey and relief hull working slowly out along the stripped moons, and the region had lit up with it, because the region had spent 9 years learning the coming home note and building a whole new idea of what a human was, and now here came a whole shipful of them, and nobody knew whether the idea was going to hold or shatter. "They think," Wesen said carefully, "that the others will be like you. The directorate's half terrified and half, I don't have the word, hopeful. They've decided humans are the apex of apex, the ones everything comes home to, the last true predators we always claimed to be, and they've built that out of one woman and one canyon, and now there's a ship of you, and they're afraid the ship won't match the story." Wren laughed at that, which she didn't often do, a short, tired, real laugh. "Wesen, I'm a mechanic. I got stranded out here by a scam birth and I pulled a thorn out of a baby because I had a jack. There's nothing to match. Whoever's on that ship, they're just people, some good, some awful, most of them tired and a long way from home, same as me." She wiped her hands. "That's the thing your whole species keeps not hearing when I say it. There's no apex. There's no magic in the note. It's just you keep a light on and you don't make yourself the thing they're afraid of, and anybody can do it. Anybody at all. That's not the terrifying part of humans, Vesson. That's the ordinary part. We're all just ordinary. That's the whole secret. That's the only secret there ever was. But she went up the road to meet the ship's boat when it put down at the docks, because someone had to, and because the directorate had asked her to, and because, though she'd never have said it, she wanted to see a human face that wasn't her own in a mirror for the first time in 9 years. The boat's ramp came down, and a young man came out of it, maybe 20, plain-faced, nervous, a relief corps patch on his shoulder, and no idea that a whole region had built a religion out of his species while he wasn't looking. And he saw a weathered woman in a grease-stained coverall standing at the foot of the ramp with a notch-eared Corin the size of a cargo hauler lying in the road behind her, and he stopped dead. They said, he started and swallowed. They said there was a human out here who, is that, ma'am, is that thing safe? And Wren Halloran, keeper of the warm bay, looked at the frightened ordinary boy and the Ridge King drowsing behind her, and the whole watching directorate braced to learn whether the story would hold, and she felt the last piece of it settle into place. That the light wasn't hers, had never been hers, was only ever a thing that got passed, and here was the next hand to pass it to, if she did this part right. She's safer than anything you've ever met, Wren said, easy and unafraid, the voice that had stopped a mother on the wreck line 10 years before. Come here. I'll show you. First thing you learn is you don't have to be brave. You just have to not be the thing she's scared of. She held out a greasy hand to the boy the way she'd held one out to a screaming pup a decade ago, the way she'd held one out to an old assessor's wrist, the way she'd held one out to a broken thing at the foot of the west wall. Come meet her. Keep your voice down, don't run, and let her decide. She's a good judge, better than most people I've met. The boy came, of course he came. And behind him the whole crew of the relief ship came, one nervous ordinary human at a time, down into a canyon full of apex predators under a string of gold lamps. And the pack sorted each of them by smell and let each of them pass, because their keeper had vouched, and the Thren of the directorate watched a second human, and a third, and a 10th, sit down by the forge with Corin pups asleep on their boots, and understood, finally and completely, that the miracle had never been the woman at all. It was the light, and the light could be lit by anyone, anywhere, who was willing to keep it on for something that couldn't light it for itself. The moon almost killed them all in Wren's 11th year, and it did it the way the old machines always die, from the inside, from the part everyone had stopped looking at. Ceph 9 was a stripped moon. That was the whole reason any of them were there. The seam the concession had chased down through the crust and gutted and abandoned in place when it ran dry. The drag lines and hopper trains and the deep works below them, all left to rust exactly where the last shift had walked away. Wren had spent 11 years pulling copper out of the shallow end of that ruin, and she'd always known, the way a mechanic knows the sound of a bearing about to go, that the deep works below the gullet were not stable, that the concession had taken the ore and left the voids, and that a stripped moon is a hollow thing, and hollow things fall. It began with the dust. She felt it before she understood it, a fine wrong tremor coming up through the shed floor at first light, through her boots, through the crate she sat on, a shiver in the stone that hadn't been there the day before. The pups felt it too. They'd come up out of the rust caves in the night, all of them, without the note, and pressed close around the shed, and Nettle stood in the road with her great head low, and her whole body reading the ground the way she read a threat, because to a Corin the ground giving way is the oldest threat there is. Vesson. Wren was already at the reader, already pulling up the old concession survey of the deep work she'd kept for 11 years because a mechanic never throws out a schematic. Get Osseth. Get the docks. The deep seam's going. The whole gutted floor under the east works. It's been settling for years and it's about to let go, and when it lets go it's going to pull the crust down over a stretch a click wide, and the docks town sits right on the lip of it. The docks town, where the concession had built its settlement generations ago on the good flat ground above the seam head, The good flat ground that was good and flat because it was the roof of the deepest, most gutted, most hollow void on the moon. 4,000 Thren lived on that roof, and the roof was about to fall into the hole the concession had spent a generation digging under it. What happened over the next 2 days would be argued about in the region for the rest of Wren's life and long after, and the argument always came back to the same impossible fact, that when Sci-Fi tried to swallow its own settlement, the 4,000 Thren of the Docks town did not flee out across the plain to the shuttle fields, the way any evacuation plan on file said they should. They fled the other way. They fled down the one road their grandparents had taught them never to walk, into the canyon their whole culture had called the worst place on the moon, toward a string of gold lamps and a human forge and a pack of apex predators. Because in 11 years the Gullet had stopped being the place you died and become, in the deep grammar of the moon, the place you went when you needed to come home. And when the ground started to fall, 4,000 people ran, without deciding to, toward the light. Wren met them at the head of the road, and she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to treat a catastrophe like a broken machine. Find the place where it's stupid and cut the right cable. The Gullet was the safest ground on the moon, and Wren knew exactly why, and it was the knowing that saved them. The canyon was old, cut by the original seam before the concession ever came, floored with the hard bedrock the miners had never bothered to gut because there was no ore in it, walled with stone that had stood for 10 million years. The voids were all under the flat ground, under the town, under the shallow works. The Gullet itself sat on bone. It was the one place on Sci-Fi that would not fall, and it had a mechanic in it who'd spent 11 years learning every meter of its ground, and a pack that could move through the dust and the dark and the collapsing wrecks faster and surer than any machine, and it had the note. Wren ran the whole thing on the note. She could not shout over 4,000 panicking Thren and a moon coming apart. She didn't try. She stood on the boom of the third dragline, up where the whole canyon could see her, with Wesen relaying on the concession net below, and she sounded the coming home note high, then low over and over off the walls, the 2 notes that 11 years of that region had learned meant safe, meant here, meant the light is on, and the Thren who'd grown up on the story of the warm bay heard it through their terror and steered by it the way the pups had always steered by the lamps, and it gathered them. Out of the dust and the dark, down onto the safe bone floor of the canyon, toward the sound that meant come home. And the pack worked the edges. That was the thing Wesen's record would carry to the whole region, the thing that finally and forever ended the old story about which of them were the predators and which were the prey. The Corin, in the 2 days the moon spent trying to fall, did not den and did not flee and did not once think of themselves. They worked the collapsing dark at the canyon's edges the way they'd worked the picket, moving as one on the trouble note Wren sounded from the boom, and they brought the settlement in. They found Thren cut off in the fallen wrecks and herded them to the safe floor. The vain gliders, 3 of them now, the young one's mate and offspring, rode the choking dust overhead and marked the stragglers from above, dropping down over each lost, blind, terrified person to guide the pack to them through air no Thren eye could see through. Nettle carried a broken-legged Dockelder 1/2 kilometer out of a collapsing hopper train on her own back, the way she'd been carried once, out from under a fallen conduit, by a splint and a pair of unafraid human hands. There was a moment, near the end of the first night, that Wren would carry the rest of her life. A Doc family had been counted in and then counted again and come up one short, a hatchling, a Thren child of 5, lost somewhere back in the choking dark between the fallen town and the canyon road, and its mother trying to go back for it into ground that was still dropping, and the crews holding her because to follow was to die. Wren heard the count come up short over Wesen's relay, and she did not think. She sounded the trouble note off the boom, 3 sharp rising notes, and then she did the thing she had never done, the thing there was no note for. She pointed the whole pack back into the dark they had just carried 4,000 people out of, and sent them to find one small life in it. The vain gliders found the child first, marking it from the dust-choked air with a cry the pack had learned to read, and a yearling Corin no bigger than a clearance beast went down into a settling wreck after it and came back out with the hatchling held in its jaws, the way a mother holds a pup, by the loose plate of the neck, gentle as breath, and laid it down at its own mother's feet on the safe stone floor and stood over it shuddering with the strain of what it had just walked into. The child was not hurt. The child, in fact, was not even frightened, because it was 5 and it had grown up in the new town, and it had been carried out of the dark in the jaws of an apex predator, and it had never once in its short life been taught that this was a thing to fear. And it looked up at the great shuddering beast that had just risked itself in a falling wreck to bring it home, and it reached up one small plated hand, and it patted the Corin on the jaw. And the whole exhausted, terrified settlement watching by lamplight made a sound that was half a sob and half something with no name, because they had spent their lives believing the dark was full of things that would eat their children, and here was the dark handing their children back. Wren watched it from the boom, filthy and hoarse and 40 hours without sleep, and she did not cry either, because there was still work to do, and a keeper does the work first and feels it after. But she marked the moment down in the private place where she kept the handful of things that made the whole stubborn life worth the living of it, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had been right to stay, and would be right to stay until the end. The pups too small to work pressed close around the gathered settlement on the safe floor, and did the one thing pups are for, which is to be warm, and 4,000 Thren spent the worst night of their lives packed into a canyon full of apex predators and lived, and were kept warm by them, and were guided by them, and were guarded by them. Under a string of gold lamps a human had hung against the cold 11 years before and never once let go dark. The east works let go on the second night. The whole flat roof of the deep void dropped into the hole the concession had dug under it, and took the empty docks town with it. 4,000 homes falling into the dark the moon had been hollowed into, and not one soul went down with them, because every soul that had lived on that doomed roof was standing on the bone floor of the gullet, in the lamplight, with a Corin pup asleep against them, and the largest predator on the moon lying in the road between them and the dark. They rebuilt on the canyon's lip after. There was nowhere else to build that anyone trusted anymore, and no one wanted to be far from the warm bay again, and so the new town of Sci-Fi grew down the margin of the gullet, the way a settlement grows around a well or a hearth or any other thing that keeps people alive, with the canyon at its heart instead of at the edge of its map, and the workshop at the heart of the canyon, and the pack at the heart of the workshop, and a string of gold lamps burning over all of it that the whole town now took its turn keeping lit. That was the change Wren was proudest of in the end, though she'd never have used the word. The light stopped being hers. It had to. There was too much of it now, too many lamps, too long a road, so the town took it up. Thren families signed onto the lamp watch the way their grandparents had signed onto shift rosters, and there was never a night the gullet went dark, because there was always someone whose turn it was to keep it burning, and keeping it burning had become the highest and simplest civic duty the moon had, not a chore, an honor, the thing you did to say I am one of the ones who keeps the light on for the ones who can't. Wesen wrote it into the town's founding charter in the high script. He called the duty by the only name that fit, the name the region had been using for 11 years without quite knowing what it would grow into. The coming home note, the charter said, is not a sound. It is the promise the sound makes. Any soul may sound it. All souls must answer it. This is the first law of the warm bay, and it is the only one we need. The young Relief Corps human stayed. His name was Tio, and he'd come down the ramp at 20 asking if the Ridge King was safe, and by the time his ship finished its circuit of the stripped moons and swung back through the Ceph system to collect him, he'd learned the shallow works and the sorting racks and the terrible synth-tea, and he'd learned to sit still while a pup fell asleep on his boots, and he'd learned slowly, badly, then well, the 2 notes. He couldn't sound them the way Wren did. Nobody could. It wasn't the sounding, she kept telling everyone, it was the 11 years. But he could keep a light on. He'd figured out that much. He told the ship to go on without him. Wren didn't make him a speech about it. She just moved the folded Relief Corps charter to sit next to her own folded Passage Home charter under the coil regulator on the bench, where the two of them gathered grease together, and put a second cot in the shed, and started teaching him the way she taught everyone, which was to hand him a broken thing and stand back. "You want to be useful out here," she said. "Learn to fix what's actually broke. Everything else is just keeping the light on while you do it." He learned. And 2 years into his learning, on an ordinary cold morning, he found the pup. It was under a fallen conduit at the shallow end of the east wall, a Corin pup, one of Nettle's own litter, gone exploring where it shouldn't and caught when a rust-rotten spar let go, half-crushed and screaming a sound Tio felt in his teeth. And he did not think about apex predators or the mother that was already coming, 600 kilos of plated fury pouring over the wreck line with the whole pack behind her, because Nettle had scented her own child's pain from half the canyon away. He thought, "That's a baby and it's stuck, and there's a jack on the bench." He got the jack, he got the conduit up. He pulled the pup out and splinted its bent limb with a length of hydraulic line the way he'd watched Wren do it 100 times, and he fed it water off his own fingers because it was too shocked to drink. And when Nettle came over the wreck line and death arrived, Tio was too busy holding the baby to run. He looked up. He saw the Ridge King bearing down, and because he'd spent 2 years learning from the only teacher who'd ever mattered, he was not afraid, and all he did was hold the pup up a little and say, "He's okay. I've got him. He's okay." Nettle stopped. Wren watched the whole thing from the shed door with her heart in her throat, and a hand raised to sound the note and never sounded it, because she saw that it didn't need sounding, because she saw the Ridge King she'd pulled out from under a conduit 11 years ago stop for a boy, holding a pup the exact way a human had once stopped a different mother by holding her. She watched Nettle come close and read the boy top to bottom with one enormous amber eye, and take the splinted pup out of his arms with a delicacy that shamed every careful thing and carry it home. And she watched the pack flow back into the wrecks, and the boy sit in the dust shaking and then get up, because he was learning to be who he was, and go back to the bench. The pup came back the next day, on its own, limping on his splint. "Well," Wren said, watching it cross the canyon toward the boy, choosing him, the way a different pup had once crossed a canyon toward her. She found she couldn't say anything else for a moment. Then, "Looks like the light's not just mine to pass anymore." And she went inside and put a third splint kit on the shelf by the door, where anyone could reach it, because that, she decided a long time ago, was the whole job. Keep the tools where the next set of hands can find them, and keep the light on, and don't be afraid, and don't be the thing they're scared of, and the rest takes care of itself. Wren Halloran grew old in the Gullet, and the Gullet grew around her, and the two things happened so gently and so together that no one, least of all Wren, could ever quite say when the young stranded mechanic became the old keeper of the warm bay. There were, by the end, 3 humans and a rotating handful of Thren who lived in the canyon and worked the shallow end and kept the lamp watch. There was a town of 11,000 on the lip above, grown up out of the 4,000 the pack had carried out of the dark. There were Corin beyond counting, 4 generations of them now, the great-grandpups of the litter Wren had first splinted denning in the same warm rust caves. There were vein gliders on the high spars, and a colony of small scavenger things she'd never gotten a clean name for that had drifted in the way everything drifted in, to the light, to the note, to the same place to come home to. The Gullet that the whole concession had once sworn no living thing crossed twice had become the most crowded and various and living stretch of ground on the moon, and the thing that had made it so was not a weapon and not a wonder and not a human being special. It was a light left on. It had only ever been a light left on. Wesen grew old too, Warden his whole long life, and he finished his record and then he started it over, because there was always more. And the last entry anyone found in it after he was gone was not in the high script at all but in plain trade hand. so that no translator could soften it and anyone at all could read it. And it said, "They asked me, at the directorate in the beginning, whether the human had tamed the beasts. I have spent my life answering that question and the answer never changed. No, she did not tame them. Taming is what the fearful do to the thing they fear, and she was never once afraid, and so she never once needed to tame anything. She did the other thing, the thing we had a word for and had forgotten the meaning of. She kept them. She kept a light on for them, and she never made herself the thing they were scared of. And she was there when the ground fell, and there when the pups were born, and there in the sun when the old king died, and they came home to her because she was home. That is not taming. There is no taming in it anywhere. It is the oldest and simplest thing there is, and my whole proud predator species had built 10,000 years of empire on being too afraid to do it, and a stranded human girl with a jack and a torch walked into the worst place on our moon and did it without once thinking it was remarkable. That is the finding. That is the whole finding. We were never the last true predators. We were only ever the ones who were too afraid to keep the light on. She taught us how. Log it. In the light. The child who would keep the light after Wren was a Thren, and Wren always said that was the ending she'd never have dared to hope for, because it meant the thing had finally stopped being a human thing at all. Her name was Sesh, and she was born in the new town on the canyon's lip in Wren's 15th year, into a generation that had never once been afraid of the Gullet, that had grown up with a Corin pup asleep on its boots, and a lampwatch shift on its family roster, and the coming home note taught in its first lessons alongside its numbers. Sesh had no old fear to unlearn. That was the whole difference between her and every Thren who'd come before, and it made her, in the end, better at the thing than any of the humans, because the humans had come to it late, out of nowhere, by accident. Sesh came to it the way a river comes to the sea. It was simply where she'd always been going. She started coming down the road on her own at 6, small and plated and fearless, and Wren, old by then, slow in the mornings the way Deacon had been, her hands not quite as sure on the fine armature work as they'd once been, put her to work the way she'd put everyone to work, which was to hand her a broken thing and stand back. And Sesh fixed it. And Sesh learned the shallow works and the sorting racks and, in time, the thing under the note, which no lesson could teach and which she'd been absorbing since before she could walk. The day Wren knew for certain was an ordinary day, the way all the days that mattered were ordinary. A pup had gotten itself into the old hopper train and panicked and gone aggressive, the way even Gullet-born pups sometimes did when fear got its claws in them, and it had a young lampwatch volunteer backed into a corner of the wreck making the thin high sound that in a grown Corin meant somebody was about to get hurt. Wren was up on the boom too far to reach it and too old to get there fast, and she opened her mouth to sound the note, and she didn't have to. Because Sesh was already there. Small, plated, fearless Sesh, 12 years old, walked into the wreck between the terrified volunteer and the panicking pup, walked into the reach of a frightened apex predator the way Wren had walked into it a lifetime ago, and held up one small empty hand, palm out, and said, in the flat, unafraid voice she'd been learning her whole life without knowing she was learning it, "Easy. Easy now. Nobody did this to you here." And the pup stopped. Wren, up on the boom, watched a Thren child do the thing her whole proud predator species had spent 10,000 years being too afraid to do, watched her do it as naturally as breathing, and had to sit down on the boom and put a hand over her mouth, because it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a life that had by then seen a great many beautiful things. The light had passed. It had passed all the way out of the human who'd carried it by accident, into the very people who'd once sent a cull package into the dark to put it out. That was the finding, Wesen would have said. That was the whole finding. "You didn't need me," Wren told the girl after, when the pup was calm and the volunteer was shaking and the ordinary day had folded shut. "You know that. You didn't need the note. You didn't need me on the boom. You didn't need any of it. You just walked in there and did it." Sesh looked up at her, 12 years old and plated and grave, and said the thing that Ren would carry with her all the way to the end. "I did need you," the girl said. "You kept the light on till I got here. That's all keeping it on is for. So the next one has enough light to find the switch." Ren didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. She just put her old sure-enough hand on the girl's plated shoulder, and they walked back up the canyon together toward the shed and the racks and the terrible synth, the old human keeper and the young Thren one, in the gold light, with the pack drowsing in the afternoon warmth around them, and a notch-eared Ridge King going gray at last in the shed door. Nettle went gray, and then Nettle went old, and Ren, old herself now, truly old, her hair gone white and her hands gone slow, sat with her through it the way she'd sat with Deacon a generation before, because she'd promised herself a long time ago that she would never leave before the light was ready to pass. And the light was passing everywhere now, in every direction all at once, and she found she could not have left if she'd wanted to. There was a new Ridge King by then. One of Nettle's own line, a huge, quiet female the town had taken to calling Ember for the rust-red cast of her plates, and Ember had grown up the way Nettle had grown up, on the note and the light and the memory of being kept, and she'd taken to lying in the shed door the way 3 generations of Ridge Kings had lain there before her. The pack ran to 400 head now and denned across the whole canyon and answered a note that half a dozen keepers could sound, and it did not need Ren Halloran any more. And that was the point, that had always been the point. You kept the light on so that one day it wouldn't need you. But Nettle needed her, that last spring, the way the old need the ones who remember them young. So Ren sat with her in the sun by the shed door, her white head against the great gray flank, a coil in her lap she wasn't winding and hadn't the strength to wind anymore, and she talked to her the way she'd talked to her for 15 years, low and easy and about nothing. The weather, the pups, Ember's litter, 4th generation, tumbling in the warm dust exactly where Nettle had tumbled, exactly where Nettle's mother had tumbled before the concession ever came. The terrible synth. Sesh, who was 17 now, and better at the whole thing than Ren had ever been. The light which would not go out, which the whole moon kept now, which had grown so far past one stranded girl, and one gutted shed that you could see it, some nights, as a real glow on the canyon rim from the shuttle fields 100 kilometers off the warm bay, lit gold against the dark, a thing ships steered by. "You did right," Ren told the old Ridge King, her hand flat on the gray head the way it had been 10,000 times, the way it had been on a different gray head a generation before. "The whole time, every bit of it. You were the best of them, Nettle, you were the best thing I ever made, and I didn't make you, I just kept a light on and you did the rest. You're okay. You hear me? You're okay. Go on and rest. The light's on. It'll stay on. Sesh has it now, and the pups have it, and the whole moon has it, and there's nothing left in the dark to be afraid of anywhere, and you did that. You and me and a jack and a torch. Go on home." And Nettle, the notch-eared Ridge King of the Gullet, the pup Ren Halloran had jacked out from under a fallen conduit on her first afternoon in the worst place on the moon, the beast that had chosen a human and been chosen back, and carried a settlement out of the dark and stopped, always, always, on a single word. Nettle let out her breath in the sun, in the lamplight, in the lee of the daughter of her own line, with an old human's unafraid voice in her ear and an old human's hand on her head. And did not take another. Ren sat with her a long time. Then, because there was a girl on the boom now who could sound it, she did not sound the note. She let Sesh sound it, and the whole gullet came in from the wrecks in the warm spring sun to lie down around their old king one last time, 4 generations of them, and the young Thren keeper stood in the shed door where a young human keeper had once stood, and sounded the 2 notes over them all, high then low, and the light held. In her last years, Ren Halloran did very little, and the pack watched her do it. And that was the part that finally made the whole region understand the thing the title of the story had always promised and never quite explained, that the beasts had begun, somewhere across the long years, to guard the workshop itself. Not just the human, the shed, the place. Ember and her line took it up as their charge the way earlier Ridge Kings had taken up the road and the pups, and it was a strange and touching thing to watch, because there was nothing left in the gullet to guard the workshop against no cull crews, no brokers, no fear. The moon had been safe for a generation, but the pack guarded it anyway. They lay across the shed door at night in rotation, always at least one great body between the forge and the dark. They walked the racks. They kept the fine drift of dust off the bench where the two folded charters had long since gone to grease and been thrown out and been replaced by nothing. Because Wren had stopped needing to remind herself she'd chosen to stay. When the old woman worked, and she worked to the very end slow at the small easy jobs, a coil, a hinge, a lamp fitting, there was always a Corin lying in the warm by her feet, and always one in the door, and always the sense to anyone who came down the road that they were entering a place that was watched over, held, kept, the way you keep a hearth or a grave or any other thing that matters more than its parts. They had begun to guard it, Sesh said once, at the Directorate Assembly that finally came to the Gullet in Wren's last winter. The whole region's authority making the pilgrimage at last, down the road, in the daylight, hands visible, to honor the human before she was gone. They had begun to guard the workshop because the workshop was where the light lived, and the light was the thing worth guarding, and the pack had always known that even when the Thren didn't. You keep asking what the beasts protect, the young keeper told the assembled directors in the shed door, with the old keeper dozing in the sun behind her and 400 Corin drowsing across the canyon. They don't protect her. They never protected her. She never needed protecting. She was never once afraid. They protect the light she keeps. They have always only protected the light. And so must we. That is the finding. That is the whole finding, and it is written in our charter now, and we came all this way to say it to her face while she can still hear it. Thank you. You kept the light on till we got here. We have the switch now. We will not let it go dark. Wren, dozing in the sun, heard enough of it to smile and to say, without opening her eyes, it was just a light. Anybody could have. Which was the truest thing she ever said, and the thing none of them would ever quite believe, and the reason the story would outlast every one of them. She died in the spring, in the sun, in the lamplight, in the shed door of the workshop she'd built out of a gutted or sorting shed in the worst place on a stripped moon, with a Corin lying warm across her feet and a young Thren keeper's hand in hers, and the whole gullet drowsing safe around her in the gold light. She had never once, in all her long life, let go dark. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid, not on the wreck line the first afternoon, not on the picket under the sonic wall, not in the dark when the moon tried to fall, and she was not afraid at the end. She'd kept a light on for 50 years for the things that couldn't light it for themselves, and there is no fear left in a person who has done that, because they have already spent it all being brave for someone else, a little at a time, on 1,000 ordinary days, until there was none left to spend on themselves and no need for any. They buried her on the margin shelf, above the third dragline, beside the old assessor who'd made them do it in the light, in sight of the shed and the racks and the whole living canyon, and they put no marker on it because she'd asked for none. The light's the marker, she told Sesh, near the end, borrowing an old woman's words she'd loved. Leave the ground clean. Let something den in it. Something did. Ember's line raised a litter in the lee of the grave the next spring, notch-eared great-great-grandpups of the pup. A stranded girl had once jacked out from under a fallen conduit, and they tumbled in the warm dust above the two clean graves while the pack drowsed, and the vane gliders rode the high thermals and the gold lamps burned along the shed eaves, kept lit that night, and every night by a moon that had made the keeping of them its first and only law. And every evening still at dusk, when the light goes down blue over the gullet and the cold comes into the stone, a keeper stands in the shed door of the workshop, a human built in predator territory, a Thren now, or a human, or whoever's turn it is, because the light belongs to all of them and none of them and the one who couldn't light it for herself, and puts 2 fingers to a lip and drops the second note like a stone off the first. High, then low. And all along the wreck line, in the draglines and the rust caves and the deep warm dens, 400 apex predators lift their great scarred heads. And then they come. They come up the road they once guarded and past the graves they still guard and into the gold light of the workshop they have guarded for 50 years. The way they have always come. The way they will always come. To the two notes that mean the same thing they have always meant. The only thing worth guarding. The only thing that was ever really there in the worst place on the moon. The light is on, come home.